I stopped by my wife's upscale psychiatric clinic to surprise her with coffee. As I waited in her lavish office, a silver fountain pen engraved with my missing daughter's name caught my attention. When I twisted the cap, the massive oak bookshelf behind me slid open with a heavy mechanical click. There, shivering on a cot in a hidden windowless room, was my daughter. The daughter we had been mourning for 2 years. Before I continue this story of deception and survival, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe the truth always finds a way to the light. My name is Vincent Hayes. I am 69 years old. For the last 4 decades, my wife Valerie and my son-in-law Garrett believed I was just a simple retired postal worker. They thought my days were spent tending to the backyard garden and reading the morning paper on the porch. They were wrong. Before I retired, I was a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I spent my entire career tracking dirty money, untangling webs of corporate fraud, and putting arrogant white-collar criminals in federal prison. I know how to read people, I know how to spot a lie hidden in a spreadsheet, and I know how to read a room. That Tuesday afternoon started ordinarily enough. I brought 2 cups of caramel macchiato to Valerie's private clinic in downtown Atlanta. Her practice catered to the city's elite, a fortress of mahogany wood and imported leather. Her receptionist told me Valerie was finishing up a session down the hall, so I let myself into her main office to wait. I sat at her massive desk. That is when I saw it. A silver fountain pen resting near her keyboard. It had the name Camille engraved on the side. My heart skipped a beat. Camille was our 35-year-old daughter, a brilliant biotech engineer who had vanished without a trace exactly 2 years ago. The police suspected foul play, but the trail went cold. I picked up the pen. It felt unusually heavy. I twisted the cap absent-mindedly. A mechanical click echoed from the wall behind me. The heavy, floor-to-ceiling bookshelf smoothly slid to the right. A cold draft hit my face. I stood up, my breath caught in my throat, and stepped into the dim light. Inside a windowless concrete space, a frail figure huddled on a small cot. She looked up. Her eyes were hollow, her cheekbones sharp from severe malnourishment. It was Camille. My beautiful, brilliant girl was alive. I fell to my knees beside the cot. I reached out my hands, trembling as I touched her pale face. She flinched, then let out a broken sob. "Dad," she whispered, her voice rough and unused. "You found me." I pulled her into my arms, feeling the sharp angles of her ribs through her thin shirt. "Who did this to you?" I asked, though a cold dread was already forming in my stomach. Camille gripped my shirt tightly. "Mom did this," she choked out. "Mom and Garrett. They kept me here. They want my patent, Dad." The words struck me like physical blows. Valerie, my wife of 40 years. The woman who had cried on my shoulder every night for the first 6 months after Camille disappeared. Garrett, the son-in-law who had organized search parties and held press conferences pleading for her safe return. They had orchestrated this entire nightmare. My paternal instinct screamed to pick her up and run out the front door. But the IRS auditor inside me immediately took control. My mind switched into forensic mode, rapidly assessing the environment. I scanned the hidden room. It was not a makeshift cell. It was a meticulously constructed holding facility. The walls were lined with expensive soundproofing foam. A heavy-duty ventilation duct provided fresh air, meaning there was professional ductwork installed behind the clinic's blueprints. A small medical fridge hummed in the corner, stocked with intravenous nutrition bags and sedatives. Valerie was a psychiatrist. She had access to these drugs. She knew exactly how to keep a human being compliant and docile. The electronic keypad on the inside of the door was disabled. This required contractor work, hush money, and careful planning. This was a clandestine operation funded by someone with deep pockets. Garrett. As a venture capitalist, he had the capital and the shady connections to build something like this off the books. They had not killed her because Camille held the biometric keys to a biotech patent worth $500 million. They needed her alive. They needed her compliance to transfer the wealth. "We need to leave right now," I told her, grabbing her fragile hand. But Camille shook her head frantically. "No, Dad, you cannot. Garrett has 2 armed private security contractors stationed at the clinic's back exit. They rotate shifts. If you try to take me out through the front, Mom's receptionist will hit the panic button. They will kill you, and then they will drug me again." I froze. She was right. I was a 69-year-old man armed only with 2 cups of coffee. If I dragged her out now, we would not make it to the elevator. I would be dead, and Camille would be relocated to a place I could never find. I had to be smart. I had to be the cold, calculating auditor who brought down criminal empires. Suddenly, the sharp, rhythmic click of designer heels echoed down the hardwood hallway outside the office. Valerie was returning from her session. The sound was like a countdown to execution. Camille's eyes widened in sheer terror. She scrambled back onto the cot, pulling her knees to her chest. "Hide, Dad," she begged. "Please just close the door." My heart shredded into 1,000 pieces. Leaving my daughter in this concrete hell felt like a betrayal of my own soul. Every instinct demanded that I stand my ground, confront the monster approaching the door, and tear her apart with my bare hands. But anger without strategy is just noise. If I confronted Valerie now, she would deny it, call security, and have me removed. She might even use her psychiatric credentials to claim I was suffering from a delusion. I would lose Camille forever. I looked deep into my daughter's terrified eyes. "I am coming back for you," I whispered with absolute certainty. "I swear on my life I will burn their world to ash." I stepped back out of the hidden room. I grabbed the silver fountain pen and twisted it in the opposite direction. The heavy bookshelf glided back into place, sealing seamlessly against the wall just as the office doorknob began to turn. I quickly sat on the plush leather sofa, grabbed the 2 coffee cups, and crossed my legs. My pulse was hammering against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask. The door opened. Valerie walked in wearing an immaculate white suit, her hair perfectly styled. She stopped, feigning pleasant surprise. "Vincent, honey," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar warm sweetness. "What a wonderful surprise." "I brought you your favorite," I replied, holding up the cup. "I know how hard you work." Valerie walked over, leaned down, and kissed my cheek. Her perfume, expensive and floral, made my stomach churn. She sat behind her desk, resting her hands right where the silver pen had been. "You are the best husband," she smiled. "I do not know what I would do without you." I smiled back. A calm, measured smile. In that exact moment, the husband who loved her died completely. The man sitting on her sofa was the forensic auditor, and I had just found the most spectacular fraud of my career. The audit had officially begun, and the penalty for her crimes would be absolute destruction. That evening, the dining room table felt like a stage set for a morbid play. I sat at the head of the table, cutting my steak with slow, deliberate motions. To my right sat Valerie, elegantly sipping her Pinot Noir, her face a carefully constructed mask of a grieving mother. Across from her sat Garrett. My son-in-law wore a custom-tailored Italian suit, his posture reeking of unearned confidence and entitlement. He swirled the wine in his glass, letting out a heavy performative sigh. "It has been 2 years, Vincent," Garrett said, leaning forward and placing his hand over his heart. "We need to honor Camille properly. I think it is time we establish the Camille Hayes Memorial Scholarship Fund. It is what she would have wanted, a way to help bright young women in biomedical fields." Valerie reached out and patted Garrett's hand. "That is a beautiful idea, Garrett. Camille had such a generous spirit. We should do everything we can to preserve her memory." I chewed my food, tasting absolutely nothing. My mind was back in that windowless concrete room, visualizing my daughter's hollow eyes and protruding ribs. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat and looked at the 2 monsters sitting in my home. "That sounds like a wonderful tribute," I said, keeping my voice soft and slightly trembling, playing the part of the broken, tired old man perfectly. "How do we start?" Garrett smiled. It was a predatory, greasy smile. "Well, I can manage the fund through my venture capital firm to maximize the returns. But we need initial seed capital to make it official. I was thinking you could liquidate your Postal Service retirement account. It is just sitting there, losing value to inflation anyway. We could transfer it to my firm by Friday, and I will handle all the heavy lifting. You will not have to worry about a single thing, Vincent." I looked at my plate, letting silence fill the room. They wanted my pension. The sheer audacity of it was almost poetic. Garrett was drowning in debt. I did not need to see his bank statements to know it. The signs were written all over him. The nervous tapping of his expensive leather shoes, the way he constantly checked his secure phone, the slight sweat on his brow despite the cool air conditioning. He owed money to dangerous people, and he was trying to squeeze every last drop of blood from our family to save his own skin. I looked up, meeting his greedy gaze. "You are right, Garrett," I said, my voice thick with fake emotion. "My retirement money should go toward Camille's legacy. I will sign the authorization forms tomorrow morning." Valerie smiled warmly at me, a smile that made my skin crawl. "You are a good father, Vincent." "I am," I thought. But they had no idea what kind of father they were dealing with. For my entire marriage, Valerie believed I sorted mail and managed pension logistics for the post office. Garrett treated me like an obsolete relic who could barely operate a smartphone. They did not know that for 40 years I was a senior forensic auditor for the Internal Revenue Service. I did not sort mail. I sorted through the ashes of burned corporate empires. I dismantled offshore tax havens in the Cayman Islands. I traced crypto wallets belonging to cartel bosses and brought down arrogant billionaires who thought they were smarter than the federal government. To me, tracking money was not a job. It was a hunting expedition. I knew how to peel back the layers of shell companies, dummy corporations, and phantom investments. I knew how to find the invisible threads connecting dirty money to dirty hands. Garrett thought he was playing chess with a toddler. He did not realize he had just invited a wolf into his slaughterhouse. I excused myself from the table early, citing a headache from the grief. They offered their fake sympathies and continued their wine, celebrating their easy victory. At midnight, the house was completely silent. I slipped out of bed, leaving Valerie sleeping soundly under the expensive silk sheets. Her breathing was steady, the peaceful rhythm of a psychopath who believed she had won. I walked down the hall to my small study, locked the heavy oak door, and turned on my custom-built laptop. It looked like an outdated brick from the outside, but the internal hardware and operating system were military-grade, fully encrypted, and completely untraceable. Garrett was staying in our guest room for the week, claiming his penthouse was undergoing renovations. It was a convenient excuse to hover over Valerie and ensure their operation was running smoothly, but his physical proximity was his greatest tactical error. By connecting his sleek high-end work laptop to my home wireless network, he had unknowingly handed me the keys to his digital kingdom. I cracked my knuckles and opened a command terminal. Decades of forensic training kicked in immediately. I deployed a packet sniffer to intercept the traffic flowing through my router. Garrett was arrogant. He used a commercial virtual private network, assuming it was enough to keep out casual hackers. But commercial security is a joke against a federal-grade intrusion protocol. Within 15 minutes, I bypassed his firewall, slipped through his security protocols, and established a silent, invisible mirror on his hard drive. The screen flooded with lines of code transforming into a neat directory of his files. I did not care about his emails or his mundane venture capital spreadsheets. I went straight for the encrypted partitions. Using a brute force decryption tool I had retained from my federal days, I broke the password on his hidden financial folders. The files cracked open like a broken safe. I began sifting through the ledgers. The financial devastation was staggering. Garrett was not just broke. He was completely underwater. He owed tens of millions to an underground syndicate of shadow investors. He had leveraged assets he did not own, created fraudulent balance sheets, and defrauded his own partners. He was a dead man walking unless he found a massive injection of cash immediately. But it was the next folder that made my blood run ice cold. It was labeled Project Chimera. I opened the master ledger for Project Chimera. The laptop screen illuminated my dark study with a harsh, glaring white light. My eyes scanned the rows of data tracking a complex web of international routing numbers offshore, holding accounts in Cyprus, and corporate aliases. At the very bottom of the spreadsheet, a pending transaction protocol was highlighted in flashing red text. It was a wire transfer setup routed through a decentralized Swiss banking exchange, waiting for a final authorization key. The amount attached to the transfer made my breath catch in my throat. $500 million. $500 million. Attached to the transaction was a legal contract of sale. They were selling the exclusive global rights to the synthetic blood plasma substitute my daughter had invented. Camille's life work. The patent she had refused to sell because she wanted it to be accessible to public hospitals, not hoarded by a predatory medical monopoly. Valerie and Garrett were stealing it, but the transfer was not active yet. A status bar blinked relentlessly at the top of my screen, displaying an automated countdown timer. The transaction was locked behind a biometric firewall. It required a live retinal scan and voice authorization from the original patent holder. The timer indicated that the next mandatory biometric verification window would open in exactly 72 hours. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together. That is why Camille was still alive. That is why they were keeping her in that concrete cell. In exactly 3 days, they were going to force my daughter to authorize the transfer, and once the money cleared, the offshore accounts, her usefulness to them, would be over. I stared at the blinking timer, the harsh digital light reflecting off my glasses. $500 million. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing Garrett's rudimentary encryption to pull the core contract out of the shadow server. I needed to see exactly who was buying the patent and how they planned to execute the transfer. Legitimate pharmaceutical companies do not route nine-figure transactions through decentralized crypto exchanges and anonymous shell corporations in the British Virgin Islands. They do not hide behind untraceable proxy servers. I ran the buyer's corporate alias through a federal database backdoor I had maintained access to since my retirement. The search results confirmed my darkest suspicions. The buyer was a front company deeply tied to a hostile foreign medical conglomerate. This was an organization infamous for acquiring revolutionary life-saving patents and burying them permanently to maintain their global monopoly on expensive, outdated treatments. Camille had developed a synthetic blood plasma substitute that could literally save millions of lives in war zones, developing nations, and remote hospitals. She wanted the formula open-sourced for the benefit of humanity. Valerie and Garrett were selling the future of global medicine to the highest, dirtiest bidder simply to cover Garrett's underground gambling debts and failed venture capital bets. I pulled up the corporate legal filings attached to the transaction. Valerie had forged power of attorney documents claiming Camille was mentally incapacitated and residing in a private, highly secure Swiss sanatorium. As her mother and a licensed, heavily respected psychiatrist, Valerie had the legal and medical authority to sign on Camille's behalf for standard business operations. She had manipulated the courts, weaponized her medical credentials, and played the role of the tragic, burdened mother to absolute perfection. But a total transfer of a Tier 1 medical patent required more than just forged signatures and a mother's tearful testimony. I initiated a deep dive trace protocol on the receiving accounts to understand the exact flow of the money. The funds were being pre-staged in 3 separate, heavily fortified offshore vaults. One account was located in Cyprus, another in the Cayman Islands, and a third deeply buried in a private bank in Luxembourg that specialized in absolute anonymity. Garrett had set up a complex automated distribution matrix. The moment the sale was finalized, the $500 million would be split and scattered. $100 million would instantly vaporize into the dark web to pay off the dangerous syndicate debt he had accumulated. The remaining $400 million would be washed through a series of luxury real estate holding companies controlled exclusively by Valerie. I leaned back in my leather chair, the cold reality settling over me like a heavy winter shroud. Valerie was not just a passive accomplice going along with her son-in-law's desperate schemes. She was the architect of this entire nightmare. She was trading our daughter's freedom, her genius, and ultimately her life for an untouchable financial empire. I brought up the Federal Patent Office's security parameters to understand why the transaction was currently stalled. The system was brilliant. Camille had engineered the legal and digital framework of her patent to prevent exactly this kind of hostile corporate takeover. The Federal Registry required a dual authentication biometric check every 6 months to maintain her sole ownership rights and to authorize any transfer of master control. This consisted of a live randomized voice prompt response paired simultaneously with a high-resolution retinal scan. It was an uncompromising system entirely foolproof against digital forgery, deepfakes, or stolen passwords. That biometric firewall was the only reason Camille was still breathing. The foreign buyers demanded complete, irreversible ownership before they released the funds. To bypass this final security layer and transfer the master rights, Garrett and Valerie needed to connect Camille directly to the federal server for a live verification session. They could not fake a retinal scan from a photograph, and they could not digitally synthesize a voice prompt that required live, unpredictable responses to a federal verification agent. They needed to drag her out of that concrete cell, prop her up in front of a secured terminal, and force her to comply. Once the system verified her identity and transferred the rights, her leverage would drop to zero. The money would move, and my daughter would suffer a tragic, fatal overdose in her hidden prison. Valerie would simply write a fake death certificate citing suicide brought on by the very mental illness she had diagnosed. The narrative would be clean, tragic, and utterly unquestionable. The countdown timer on Garrett's screen was not just a financial schedule. It was a death warrant. 71 hours, 45 minutes, and 12 seconds. The red numbers ticked down relentlessly, each second a heavy hammer striking against the anvil of my chest. Time was evaporating, and the parameters of my mission were impossibly tight. I needed to extract her safely. But my previous tactical assessment remained brutally accurate. The psychiatric clinic was a fortress hidden in plain sight. Valerie employed former military contractors for her private security. They were heavily armed, highly trained, and deeply loyal to Garrett's payroll. A frontal assault by a single elderly man was suicide. Calling the local police was equally dangerous and strategically foolish. Valerie had built a pristine reputation in Atlanta. She was a prominent mental health expert, a pillar of the medical community, and a wealthy, influential donor to the Police Benevolent Fund. If I called a local detective or filed a missing person report based on what I saw, Valerie would be notified before the squad car even left the precinct. She would immediately trigger the clinic's lockdown protocol. She would move Camille through a service elevator to a secondary black site, scrub the hidden room clean, and use her medical authority to have me committed to a psychiatric ward for suffering severe grief-induced delusions. I would spend the rest of my life in a padded cell, and Camille would disappear forever. I could not rely on standard law enforcement. The bureaucratic red tape would take weeks to cut through, and Camille only had 3 days. I needed precision, overwhelming force, and absolute secrecy. I needed to move faster than the ticking clock on my screen. I took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the burning rage of a father and channeling the cold, ruthless logic of a senior federal auditor. I needed an extraction team that operated completely off the books. Men who did not ask questions, did not carry badges, and did not leave a trace. I needed leverage resources and a legal firewall so impenetrable that Valerie and Garrett would never see the executioner coming until the blade was already swinging. I closed the decrypted folders on Garrett's laptop, running a specialized scrubbing program to ensure my digital footprint was completely wiped. I severed the mirror connection and shut down my terminal, leaving the study in total darkness. The house was dead quiet, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic ticking of the hallway clock. I reached into the hidden false bottom of my desk drawer and pulled out a prepaid burner phone I had not turned on in 3 years. I powered it up, the harsh green screen illuminating the deep lines of my face. I dialed a highly secure number I had memorized a decade ago, a number that did not exist in any public registry. The line rang twice before a gravelly, sleep-heavy voice answered. "It is 3 a.m, Vincent." The voice grumbled, thick with annoyance and fatigue. "This better involve a collapsed international bank or a dead senator." "Jonathan," I said, my voice steady and cold as winter ice. "I need a shadow crew in Atlanta immediately. Full tactical extraction completely off the grid, and I need you to draft an ironclad blind trust that can swallow $500 million in 3 days." Jonathan Cole, a ruthless corporate lawyer who knew every dirty secret in New York and possessed the resources of a small nation-state, paused. The sleep instantly vanished from his voice, replaced by the sharp, calculating tone of a predator sensing blood in the water. "Who are we hunting?" old friend Jonathan asked. "My family," I replied. 6 hours later, the neon sign of an abandoned diner buzzed in the early morning fog on the outskirts of Atlanta. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth, nursing a cup of black coffee. The bell above the door chimed, and Jonathan Cole walked in. Even in a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most cars, he moved with the quiet lethality of a street brawler. He slid into the booth across from me, dropping a thick, unmarked manila folder onto the laminated table. He did not offer empty condolences. He knew me too well for that. "We have a 48-hour window," Jonathan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I pulled the clinic blueprints. Your wife spared no expense. Reinforced steel doors, an independent power grid, and 2 former private military contractors on staggered shifts. A standard smash and grab will end in a bloodbath and a police standoff." I unrolled the blueprints, tracing the ventilation shafts with my finger. "We do not smash," I replied. "We dissect. I need a ghost team." They bypass the alarms, neutralize the guards silently, and extract Camille without triggering the central panic system. Jonathan nodded, pulling out a secure encrypted tablet. "My men are already in the air. They are Tier 1 operators ghosts who specialize in corporate black site extractions. But they need a distraction, Vincent. If Valerie is anywhere near that clinic, the variables multiply and the risk of collateral damage skyrockets. You need to keep your wife and that parasite son-in-law completely occupied and far away from downtown Atlanta." I took a slow sip of my coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. "I will handle my family," I said. "Just get my daughter out of that concrete box." I returned to the house just as the sun fully crested the horizon. I found Garrett standing in the kitchen, aggressively tapping on his phone. He wore a plush cashmere robe, looking entirely too comfortable in a house paid for by my decades of federal service. When he heard my footsteps, he snapped his phone shut and plastered on that greasy, rehearsed smile. "Out early, Vincent," he asked, his eyes darting to my shoes, checking for mud or clues. "I just needed some fresh air," I said, keeping my posture slightly stooped, playing the role of the weary, grieving father. "The house feels too quiet lately." Garrett hummed a sympathetic note that sounded entirely hollow. "Well, try to take it easy. We have a lot of paperwork to finalize for Camille's memorial fund soon." I nodded and shuffled past him toward the hallway. But the IRS had trained me to read micro-expressions to notice the slight tension in a man's jaw when his survival was on the line. Garrett was panicking. My unscheduled absence had triggered his paranoia. He was a man drowning in a 9-figure syndicate debt, and any unpredictable variable terrified him. Later that afternoon, I watched him through the sheer curtains of my study window. He walked down the driveway toward my vintage sedan. He casually glanced up at the house, ensuring the coast was clear before kneeling beside the driver's side door. He reached under the chassis. It was a swift, practiced motion. 10 seconds later, he stood up, wiped his hands on his expensive jeans, and walked back inside. The moment the front door closed, I went out to the garage. I slid a mechanic's mirror under the car frame. Right behind the front wheel, well attached by a heavy-duty magnet, was a small matte black GPS tracking puck. Garrett was tracking my every move. He wanted to ensure I was not visiting lawyers, the police, or anyone who could jeopardize his $500 million payday. My initial instinct was to crush the device under my heel, but anger is the enemy of strategy. A forensic auditor knows that a surveillance tool works both ways. If he wanted to watch a dot on a screen, I would give him exactly what he wanted to see. I left the tracker exactly where it was. Over the next 2 days, I turned Garrett's surveillance against him. I knew he was sitting in my guest room, obsessively refreshing a tracking app on his encrypted phone, waiting for me to make a wrong move. Instead, I drove my sedan to the most depressing, predictable locations an exhausted, broken elderly man would visit. My first stop was Whispering Pines, a high-end assisted living facility on the north side of the city. I walked into the lobby, picked up a stack of glossy brochures, and spent an hour sitting in their manicured courtyard, staring blankly at a fountain. I made sure to ask the admissions director detailed questions about their memory care units and independent living transitions. I played the part of a man whose house was suffocating him with the ghosts of his missing daughter, a man who just wanted to fade away quietly. The following morning, I drove to a retirement community in the suburbs. I took a guided tour of their facilities, slowly shuffling through the dining halls and recreation rooms. I collected more pamphlets, signed guest registries, and drank terrible complimentary tea. To the little blinking dot on Garrett's screen, my digital footprint told a cohesive, tragic story. Vincent Hayes was giving up. He was preparing to sell his home hand over his assets and check himself into a facility to wait for the end. It was the perfect psychological camouflage. It aligned flawlessly with the narrative Valerie and Garrett had constructed about me. They needed me to be weak, compliant, and ready to surrender my financial independence to them. When I returned home each evening, I left the nursing home brochures spread carelessly across the kitchen island. I watched from the hallway as Valerie picked one up, a cold, triumphant smirk crossing her face before she quickly hid it away. She whispered to Garrett in the living room, their voices hushed but thick with arrogant relief. They looked at me with fake pity during dinner, silently celebrating my manufactured surrender. I ate my dinner slowly, absorbing their condescending glances. Every false word of comfort they offered only hardened my resolve. I was the architect of their downfall, hiding behind the mask of a defeated old man. By the morning of the third day, the tension in the house had completely evaporated. Garrett's paranoid edge was gone. He sat at the kitchen bar, casually scrolling through sports scores on his phone, his posture loose and relaxed. He had swallowed the bait whole. He firmly believed I was out of the equation, entirely consumed by my search for a quiet place to die. He even offered to help me review the nursing home contracts, masking his greed with a veneer of helpful son-in-law charm. I thanked him, my voice frail, and retreated to my study. I locked the door and pulled the encrypted burner phone from its hidden compartment. The screen lit up with a single highly secured text message from Jonathan Cole. The digital text cut through the silence of the room. "The package is secure. Ghost team is fully deployed and holding at the perimeter, awaiting the green light." I stared at the words, feeling a cold electric surge of adrenaline flood my veins. The trap was set. The hunters were in position. Now I just needed to pull Valerie away from her fortress and let my wolves off the leash. I walked out of my study and headed straight for the kitchen. Valerie was pouring herself a generous glass of expensive red wine, preparing to review her evening patient files on her tablet. I needed her undivided attention, and I needed to ground her entirely to this house. I gripped the edge of the granite kitchen island and intentionally knocked over a heavy crystal vase. It shattered loudly across the immaculate tile. I let out a sharp, breathless gasp and deliberately collapsed onto the hardwood floor, clutching my chest with both hands. Valerie dropped her wine glass, the red liquid splashing across the floor like blood, and rushed over to me. "Vincent," she shouted, her clinical training temporarily overriding her sociopathic detachment. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid. I clenched my jaw, feigning the exact symptoms of a mild myocardial infarction. My chest, I wheezed, grabbing her wrist with a desperate iron grip. "It feels like a vice is crushing my ribs." Garrett ran into the kitchen, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and opportunistic calculation. "Should I call an ambulance?" he asked quickly. I could see his mind racing, calculating how rapidly he could access my accounts if I died right there on the floor. "No," I rasped, squeezing Valerie's wrist even harder to sell the panic. "No hospitals. Please, just get my pills from upstairs. Stay with me, Val. Do not leave me." Valerie barked orders at Garrett to fetch my blood pressure medication and a glass of cold water. She checked my pulse, her manicured fingers cold and clinical against my skin. For the next 5 hours, I kept her entirely anchored to my side in the master bedroom. Every time she tried to pull away to check her phone or her clinic surveillance feed, I would let out a strained groan, forcing her to administer more water, check my vitals, and play the role of the devoted wife. She was completely trapped in the house, physically bound to my bedside by the very medical oath she had perverted. While I kept my wife hostage with my fabricated agony, Jonathan Cole's ghost team moved on the psychiatric clinic. I had memorized the tactical layout during my visit and communicated every blind spot and vulnerability to Jonathan. At exactly 2 a.m, a customized black utility van parked silently in the alley behind Valerie's upscale practice. 4 men dressed in matte black tactical gear disabled the exterior alarm grid using a military-grade localized signal jammer. The private security contractors Garrett had hired were ex-mercenaries, but they were lazy, relying entirely too heavily on automated perimeter alerts. The first guard was neutralized in the rear smoking area, rendered unconscious by a fast-acting injected sedative before he could even reach for his radio. The second guard stationed near the front reception desk was incapacitated with a silent kinetic stun device through a blind spot in the main hallway. There were no gunshots. There were no panic buttons pressed. The extraction team moved with terrifying practiced efficiency, bypassing the heavy mahogany doors and entering Valerie's main office. The lead operator located the silver fountain pen on the desk. With a synchronized twist, the heavy oak bookshelf slid smoothly open, revealing the hidden concrete cell. Inside, Camille shrank back against the far wall, her eyes wide with absolute terror, expecting her mother or Garrett to walk through the opening to drug her again. Instead, the lead operator removed his tactical mask, illuminating the dim room with a soft red flashlight. "Camille Hayes," he whispered calmly, keeping his hands highly visible and non-threatening. "Your father sent us. We are getting you out of here right now." He handed her a specialized thermal blanket, wrapping it carefully around her frail, shivering shoulders. The medical fridge and the intravenous drip stands were left exactly as they were to preserve the scene. 2 operators flanked her, lifting her gently and guiding her out of the secret room. They moved her swiftly through the sterile hallways of the clinic, out the back exit, and into the waiting utility van. The operation took exactly 9 minutes from breach to extraction. Not a single alarm was triggered. Not a single drop of blood was spilled. But the extraction was only the first half of the operation. Breaking Camille out was entirely pointless if Valerie discovered she was missing before the 72-hour biometric window closed. If Valerie checked her secure surveillance feed and saw an empty cot, she would immediately alert Garrett. They would panic, scatter the funds, destroy the evidence, and disappear into the wind. I needed them to feel completely safe and in total control until the trap snapped shut on their necks. Inside the hidden room, the team's cyber warfare specialist remained behind for an additional 3 minutes. He approached the closed-circuit high-definition camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. This camera fed directly into a private server that only Valerie could access from her encrypted phone. The specialist spliced a hardware bypass module directly into the camera's fiber optic coaxial cable. Within seconds, he intercepted the live feed. Using advanced rendering software, he pulled 12 hours of previous surveillance footage from the local hard drive. He isolated a seamless, continuous 90-minute segment of Camille sleeping quietly under her thin blanket, curled up defensively on the cot. The dim lighting, the harsh shadows, and the subtle rising and falling of her chest were perfectly captured. The specialist injected this looped footage back into the main feed, creating an infinite, undetectable broadcast. To anyone watching the security monitor from the outside, the room appeared entirely undisturbed. Camille was seemingly still trapped, heavily sedated, and waiting for the biometric transfer. The digital illusion was flawless. The specialist stepped back, visually confirmed the feed stabilization on his wrist monitor, and quickly exited the room. The heavy oak bookshelf slid back into place, locking with a definitive mechanical click. The clinic was left exactly as they found it. The unconscious guards were dragged back to their original positions, their memories of the last 20 minutes chemically wiped by the sedatives. When they woke up, they would attribute their grogginess to simple, mundane fatigue. Back in my bedroom, the grandfather clock in the hallway struck 3 in the morning. Valerie was sitting in a velvet chair by the window, her head nodding off, completely exhausted from hours of playing the attentive, worried wife. My burner phone, concealed securely beneath my pillow, delivered a single silent vibration. I slowly slid my hand under the fabric and pressed the screen. A text message from Jonathan glowed in the dark. "The package is secure. The bird has flown the cage." A deep, profound wave of relief washed over my soul. My daughter was safe. She was finally out of their clutches and under heavy protection. I closed my eyes and took a long, steady breath. The strained, shallow wheezing I had maintained for 5 hours stopped instantly. I sat up in bed, my posture straightening, the fabricated weakness evaporating from my bones like mist. I looked across the dark room at the woman I had married, the monster who had imprisoned our child for money. The frightened, ailing old man she thought she was manipulating was gone. I stared at her resting face, my eyes narrowing with the cold, ruthless precision of a predator ready to strike. The audit was over. Now it was time for the execution. The morning sun broke through the heavy velvet curtains of the master bedroom, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the room. I sat up slowly, rubbing my chest, maintaining the illusion of a broken man who had barely survived the night. Valerie was already awake, sitting perfectly poised at her mahogany vanity mirror. Through the reflection of the glass, I watched her pick up her encrypted smartphone. She tapped the screen, loading the private surveillance feed from the psychiatric clinic. I held my breath, carefully studying the microscopic shifts in her facial muscles. A sudden wave of tension left her shoulders, and her posture relaxed completely. The cyber warfare specialist from Jonathan Cole's Ghost team had done his job flawlessly. Valerie saw exactly what she desperately wanted to see. She saw Camille curled up under the thermal blanket, lying perfectly still in her concrete cage. Valerie let out a quiet, satisfied sigh, locking the phone screen and turning to me with a brilliant, predatory smile. "You gave us quite a scare last night, Vincent," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit affection. "How is your chest feeling today?" "Much better," I lied, making sure my voice sounded deliberately raspy and weak. "I am just incredibly tired." The bedroom door swung open without a knock, and Garrett walked in holding a sleek leather portfolio. He did not bother asking how I felt or if my heart rate had stabilized. His eyes were fixed entirely on the prize, gleaming with poorly concealed greed. "Vincent, I am glad you are sitting up," he said, pulling a thick stack of legal documents from the portfolio. "Valerie and I were talking while you rested. This house is simply too big for you now. With your heart acting up, the massive wooden staircase is a severe hazard. We found a premium buyer who is willing to pay significantly above market value in cash. All we need is your signature on this power of attorney, and I can handle the entire sale process while you rest in bed." I stared at the pristine paperwork resting on the edge of the mattress. They wanted absolutely everything. First they demanded my pension, and now they were coming for the very roof over my head. I looked past Garrett, my eyes drifting to the wide hallway outside our bedroom. I remembered the exact summer weekend I laid those hardwood floors. I had spent 2 grueling months renovating this house when Camille was just a little girl. I built the heavy oak bookshelves in the living room with my own bare hands, sanding the edges for days until they were perfectly smooth, so she would not get splinters when she reached for her favorite science encyclopedias. On the wooden door frame of the kitchen pantry downstairs, there were still tiny pencil marks carved into the white paint. Those marks tracked Camille's height every single year on her birthday. This house was not just a piece of real estate. It was a living archive of my daughter's childhood, a physical monument to the family I thought I was protecting and building. Valerie had stood right beside me holding the measuring tape, smiling warmly as our daughter grew taller and smarter. Now that same woman was trying to liquidate those sacred memories to fund a desperate getaway with a criminal son-in-law. "It is truly for the best," Vincent Valerie urged softly. She sat on the edge of the mattress and placed a warm, manicured hand over mine. "We will find you a nice single-story place. A quiet, assisted living community where you do not have to worry about maintenance or sudden medical emergencies. You need to let us take this heavy burden off your shoulders." I looked at her then, up at Garrett. Their arrogance and greed were so absolute that it had blinded them to the most basic principles of operational security. They looked at me and saw an ailing, defeated old man clinging pathetically to the past. They did not see the executioner sitting right in front of them. "You are right," I whispered, letting my hand shake just enough to make the gesture look strained and reluctant. "It is time to let go of this place." I picked up the heavy brass pen Garrett eagerly offered me. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name on the dotted line. Garrett practically snatched the documents from the bed the very second the ink dried. He quickly flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the signatures with hungry, undeniable satisfaction. What he did not realize, what his blinding arrogance prevented him from ever noticing, was the microscopic alteration in the legal boilerplate text on page 4. When I had hacked into Garrett's encrypted laptop 2 nights ago, I did not just steal his hidden financial ledgers and offshore routing numbers. I anticipated his exact next move. A venture capitalist drowning in syndicate debt will always attempt to aggressively liquidate high-value physical assets to generate immediate cash flow. I knew he had drafted the power of attorney documents and queued them on his hard drive for printing. I had Jonathan Cole's cyber team intercept the file in the digital background. Jonathan, a ruthless master of corporate warfare, had rewritten the hidden legal clauses before Garrett even sent the file to the home printer. By signing that document, I did not authorize Garrett to sell my home. The hidden clauses explicitly triggered an irrevocable federal-level asset freeze. My signature executed an immediate legally binding transfer of the house, all joint bank accounts, and every shared investment portfolio into an anonymous, impenetrable blind trust managed exclusively by Jonathan's law firm. Furthermore, the document contained a brutal poison pill clause that instantly revoked Valerie's access to any marital funds under the strict legal pretext of fiduciary protection against elder financial abuse. I had just financially decapitated my own wife, and she was smiling at me as if I had handed her the winning lottery numbers. "I will take these straight to the notary public right now," Valerie said eagerly, grabbing the leather portfolio from Garrett. She practically floated toward the bedroom door, her white silk blouse catching the bright morning light. "Rest well, Vincent. I will be back by lunch. Garrett, make sure he drinks plenty of water and does not exert himself." "Of course," Garrett replied, his eyes already glued to his smartphone screen, undoubtedly calculating his imaginary profits and planning which underground debts he would pay off first. I leaned back against the plush pillows, pulling the heavy comforter up to my chest. The bedroom door closed, and I listened to the sharp, rhythmic click of Valerie's heels fading quickly down the staircase. I heard the front door open, and the powerful engine of her luxury SUV roar to life in the driveway. She was driving off in total triumph, rushing across the city to a notary public to validate a legal document that would instantly lock her out of her own life. She thought she was securing her golden parachute, entirely unaware that she had just voluntarily signed away her legal ownership of the house, her liquid bank accounts, and her future freedom. The execution had officially begun. I closed my eyes, a cold, genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Let her drive. The impending crash was going to be absolutely spectacular. That evening, my miraculous recovery was required for public consumption. Valerie was a prominent figure in Atlanta's elite medical community, and skipping the annual Hospital Foundation charity gala was simply out of the question for her. She needed her prop husband by her side to maintain the flawless illusion of our perfect grieving family. They dressed me in a tailored tuxedo, treating me like a compliant fragile doll, and paraded me into a massive ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and overflowing champagne flutes. The room was packed tightly with billionaires, elite surgeons, and ruthless venture capitalists. Garrett was entirely in his element. He moved through the wealthy crowd like a starving shark sensing blood in the water, a glass of expensive scotch permanently affixed to his hand. As the long night wore on, the excessive alcohol completely stripped away his polished professional veneer, revealing the arrogant, desperate thug hiding underneath the expensive Italian suit. I stood quietly by the extravagant dessert table, leaning heavily on a wooden cane I did not actually need to use. Garrett approached me with a tight group of his wealthy, obnoxious tech investors. He slurred his words slightly, gesturing wildly toward me with his drink, making a spectacle of my presence. "Gentlemen, look at my father-in-law," Garrett announced loudly, his harsh voice carrying easily over the string quartet playing in the corner of the room. 40 years sorting mail for the federal government, and now he is living the dream entirely on my dime. A complete freeloader, utterly dependent on my generosity to keep a roof over his head. The investors chuckled uncomfortably, exchanging awkward glances. I looked over at Valerie. She stood just a few feet away, sipping her champagne. She did not defend me. She did not intervene. She simply took a delicate sip from her crystal glass and offered a cold, patronizing smirk. To them, I was just a pathetic old man eating their expensive hors d'oeuvres. I kept my head bowed, my shoulders slumped in manufactured defeat. I let the intense humiliation wash over me, absorbing every insult, every mocking laugh, and every condescending glare. I played the part of the broken, humiliated elder, flawlessly offering nothing but a meek, silent presence. But inside my tuxedo jacket, resting right against my chest, my encrypted burner phone was actively recording every single syllable. The high-definition microphone captured the ambient noise of the ballroom and the crisp, damning clarity of Garrett's drunken arrogance. "Oh, you do not even know the half of it," Garrett continued, leaning in closer to his associates, eager to inflate his own fragile ego. "The old man just signed over his entire estate to me this morning. Power of attorney, the house, the savings, all of it. You have to manage these useless liabilities before they become a severe burden on your own working capital, right? I am restructuring the whole family portfolio to cut the dead weight. In fact, by this weekend, my firm is finalizing a massive acquisition that will completely redefine the biomedical market. We are talking a 9-figure liquidity event, $500 million in offshore capital." He took another large gulp of his scotch, his eyes gleaming with greedy, drunken euphoria. A massive influx of completely untraceable cash. And the best part is that the original patent holder is completely out of the picture. I just smiled weakly, letting my hands tremble violently on the handle of my cane. "Please, Garrett," I whispered, injecting a pathetic, pleading tremor into my voice so the microphone would pick up my apparent distress. "Do not talk about Camille's work like this. It is deeply disrespectful to her memory." Garrett scoffed, waving his hand dismissively in my face. "Do not start crying now, Vincent. Camille's memory is about to make us all very, very rich. You should be getting down on your knees and thanking me for turning her little science project into a global empire." I bowed my head again, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Garrett had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of audio evidence. He had publicly confessed to seizing my assets, hinted at the hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar biomedical patent, and admitted to moving the illicit funds through offshore accounts. He had wrapped his own financial execution in a neat, arrogant bow. I let out a ragged, theatrical cough and clutched my chest tightly. Valerie, whose medical reputation was on the line if she let her husband collapse at a highly publicized charity gala, immediately rushed over to my side. "Vincent, are you feeling unwell again?" she asked, masking her intense irritation with a sickly sweet tone of medical concern. "My chest is tight," I wheezed, looking up at her with fearful eyes. "I just need some fresh air. I think I should take a taxi home to rest." Valerie nodded quickly, eager to remove the embarrassing liability from the glittering room. "I will call a car for you. Go rest in bed. Garrett and I need to stay here and network with the hospital board of directors." I limped slowly out of the grand ballroom, shuffling past the valet stand and into the cool, crisp night air of downtown Atlanta. The moment the heavy glass doors closed securely behind me, my exaggerated limp vanished completely. I straightened my spine, tossing the wooden cane into a nearby decorative planter with a satisfying thud. I walked briskly around the corner of the building, slipping into the dark, secluded shadows of a nearby concrete parking garage. I pulled the encrypted burner phone from my jacket pocket. The screen illuminated my face with a harsh, cold blue light. I rapidly compiled the digital dossier. I attached the crystal-clear audio recording of Garrett's drunken confession, The decrypted financial ledgers detailing his underground syndicate debts, the offshore routing numbers for the Swiss and Cayman accounts, and the forged power of attorney documents Valerie had drafted. I also included the undeniable proof of Camille's biometric patent lock and the impending fraudulent transfer. I opened a secure encrypted communication channel that bypassed all standard civilian networks. I routed the massive data package directly to the personal terminal of a highly ranked associate director at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and simultaneously carbon copied the director of criminal investigations at the Internal Revenue Service. These were men I had personally mentored decades ago, men who knew that if Vincent Hayes sent a targeted file, it was not a casual suspicion. It was a guaranteed airtight federal conviction. I hit send. The green progress bar shot across the screen, uploading the damning evidence into the highest echelons of federal law enforcement. I stood in the quiet darkness of the parking garage, watching the digital confirmation flash across my screen, indicating the data transfer was absolutely complete. I locked the phone and slid it back into my pocket, feeling the cold night breeze sweep through the concrete pillars. Miles away, inside the heavily fortified server rooms of the Internal Revenue Service and the FBI Cyber Division, automated forensic alarms began to trigger instantly. The evidence was immediately processed by advanced federal algorithms specifically designed to hunt international money laundering and corporate fraud. Red flags erupted across global financial networks in real time. Within seconds, a global irreversible asset freeze order was generated by a federal judge on emergency standby. The digital mandate shot through the international banking system at lightning speed, actively targeting Garrett's venture capital firm, his hidden shell companies, and the specific offshore vaults waiting for the $500 million transfer. Every credit line, every corporate account, and every hidden ledger tied to Garrett Lawson and Valerie Hayes was systematically locked down. The financial guillotine had dropped with absolute precision. They were entirely cut off from the global economy. I adjusted the cuffs of my tuxedo and walked out of the shadows to hail a passing cab. The trap was permanently locked, and by tomorrow morning Garrett and Valerie would wake up to a world where their money, their power, and their freedom had completely ceased to exist. The morning sun rose over Atlanta, casting a bright, unforgiving light on the city. For most people, it was the start of a beautiful Friday. For Garrett Lawson, it was the beginning of his absolute destruction. Unaware of the digital guillotine that had dropped the night before, Garrett woke up with a pounding hangover and an inflated sense of invincibility. He left the house early, driving his imported sports car to the high-end luxury shopping district in Buckhead. He had a specific prize in mind, a custom-made diamond-encrusted platinum watch he had been eyeing for months, priced at a staggering $250,000. He wanted a trophy to celebrate his impending $500 million payday. He walked into the exclusive boutique with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he owned the world. He tried on the watch, admired his reflection in the pristine mirrors, and slapped his heavy, solid metal black corporate credit card onto the glass counter. The impeccably dressed sales associate smiled politely, picked up the card, and inserted it into the private terminal. A soft beep echoed in the quiet store. The associate frowned slightly, tapped the screen, and tried again. "I am terribly sorry, Mr. Lawson," the associate said, his tone perfectly neutral but laced with underlying judgment. "The terminal is saying the transaction is declined." Garrett let out a harsh, condescending laugh. "That is impossible. Swipe it again. There is no limit on that account." The clerk complied, but the screen flashed bright red. "It is coming back with a hard federal freeze code, sir. The issuer has locked the account." Garrett snatched the card back, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. He pulled out his heavily encrypted smartphone and opened his primary offshore banking application to check his corporate liquidity. The screen loaded, spinning for a terrifying few seconds. When the dashboard finally appeared, the blood instantly drained from his face. His operating capital, his venture fund reserves, the syndicate staging accounts, everything displayed absolute zeros. There were no pending transactions. There were no maintenance errors. The money had simply evaporated into thin air, replaced by stark red notifications citing a Department of Treasury mandate. He was completely broke, and worse, he was completely exposed to the violent underground creditors who expected their money by the weekend. Panic struck Garrett like a physical blow. He stumbled out of the boutique, ignoring the confused calls of the sales associate, and practically fell into the driver's seat of his sports car. His hands shook violently as he dialed Valerie's private number. She answered on the second ring, her voice calm and clinical. "Garrett, I am reviewing patient files. This better be important. The money is gone, Garrett screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with sheer terror. The accounts are locked. The corporate cards are declined. Everything is showing a federal freeze code. Valerie went entirely silent for 2 seconds before her arrogant composure took over. Calm down, you fool. It is a banking glitch. You likely triggered an automated fraud alert moving funds around last night while you were drunk. It is not a glitch, Val, he roared, slamming his fist against the steering wheel. The syndicate accounts are completely zeroed out. If those men find out I do not have their capital, they will kill me. We need the emergency contingency funds right now. We need Camille to manually override the biometric lock and push the reserve cash to a clean account before the whole network collapses. I am already at the clinic, Valerie said, her voice finally losing its icy detachment, replaced by a sharp edge of genuine alarm. Get over here immediately. Use the private underground parking entrance. Do not speak to anyone. Garrett sped through the morning traffic like a madman, running red lights and swerving between lanes. His slick veneer was entirely shattered, replaced by the primal fear of a cornered animal. He arrived at the psychiatric clinic in record time, abandoning his car in the VIP garage. He bypassed the main reception desk and sprinted down the lavish mahogany hallway, nearly knocking over a decorative sculpture in his haste. Valerie was waiting for him inside her office, pacing behind her massive desk. Her immaculate white suit suddenly looked restrictive, reflecting the tension tightening around her neck. I checked the secure server feed, she said, holding up her tablet. Camille is still fast asleep on the cot. Nothing has been disturbed. We will wake her up, force the manual retinal override, drain the remaining untraceable reserve accounts, and figure out the federal freeze later. Garrett nodded frantically, wiping thick beads of sweat from his forehead. Open the door. Open it right now. Valerie walked around her desk and picked up the silver fountain pen engraved with her daughter's name. Her hand was surprisingly steady as she twisted the cap. The heavy mechanical click echoed through the room. The massive oak bookshelf slid smoothly to the right, revealing the cold, dim concrete hallway that led to the secret holding facility. They rushed inside, their footsteps echoing loudly against the sterile floor. Valerie punched the bypass code into the keypad outside the heavy steel door. The magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy thud. She pushed the door wide open, stepping into the windowless room, expecting to see the fragile, terrified figure of her daughter cowering on the small cot. The room was completely empty. Valerie froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The cot was neatly made. The medical fridge hummed quietly in the corner, but the intravenous bags were gone. The thermal blanket was folded precisely at the foot of the bed. Camille was simply not there. Garrett pushed past Valerie, his eyes darting frantically around the small concrete space as if Camille could somehow be hiding in the shadows. "Where is she?" he screamed, turning to Valerie with wild, bloodshot eyes. "You said you just checked the camera feed. You said she was sleeping." Valerie looked down at her tablet, her mind violently rejecting the reality in front of her. The screen still showed the live video feed. It clearly displayed Camille lying on the cot, the dim lighting masking her features, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Valerie looked from the screen to the empty cot, the horrifying truth crashing down on her. The feed was a hijacked, infinitely looping recording. They had been watching a ghost. Garrett let out a guttural sound of pure panic and rushed toward the medical monitoring terminal mounted on the far wall. The screen, which usually displayed Camille's vital signs and the biometric lock status, had been wiped completely clean. Instead of medical data, a single line of bright green text blinked steadily against the black background. The audit has begun. Valerie stared at the glowing letters, her sophisticated psychiatric training utterly failing to process the magnitude of their defeat. Someone had bypassed her state-of-the-art security, neutralized her armed former military contractors without raising a single alarm, successfully hijacked a closed-circuit encrypted video feed, and extracted the most valuable biomedical asset on the planet. And they left a calling card that reeked of absolute calculated dominance. It was the buyers, Garrett yelled, his voice echoing shrilly off the concrete walls. The foreign conglomerate. They found out about the syndicate debt. They realized we were compromised and they stole her. They hired a black ops team to take the patent by force. They robbed us, Val. Valerie spun around, her face twisting into a mask of pure, vicious rage. They did not rob us, you incompetent parasite. You led them right to her. You could not keep your mouth shut at the gala. You practically broadcasted our entire operation to a room full of venture capitalists and foreign investors while you were drunk on scotch. You brought this heat down on us. I brought the heat. Garrett sneered, stepping aggressively toward her. You are the one who hired discount security guards who sleep on the job. You are the one who built a concrete prison in the middle of downtown Atlanta and thought a stupid bookshelf trick would keep out professional corporate espionage teams. This is your clinic, your facility, your failure. I kept this operation flawless for 2 years, Valerie screamed back, her perfectly manicured facade cracking into pieces. Everything was perfect until you started leveraging non-existent assets to pay off underground loan sharks. You ruined this. You destroyed my life's work. The impenetrable alliance between the greedy venture capitalist and the sociopathic psychiatrist shattered instantly. Surrounded by the cold concrete walls they had built to imprison my daughter, they turned into cornered rats. They hurled accusations, threats, and vicious insults at one another, completely unaware that the real architect of their destruction was not a foreign corporate hit squad. It was the quiet, elderly postal worker sitting comfortably in his living room across town, waiting to tighten the noose even further. I sat in the quiet, immaculate comfort of my living room, the bright morning light streaming through the large bay windows. To any casual observer, I was just a frail, elderly man enjoying a warm cup of Earl Grey tea, recovering from a terrifying cardiac event. But resting discreetly deep inside my right ear was a high-fidelity cryptographic earpiece. It was connected directly to the microscopic microphone Jonathan Cole's extraction team had planted inside the clinic's concrete cell just hours prior. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea, letting the rich flavor settle as the violent, chaotic symphony of my wife and son-in-law's panic played out in real time. Their voices bounced harshly off the soundproofed walls of the empty hidden room, amplifying their absolute, unadulterated desperation. They were screaming at the top of their lungs, their polished, elite vocabularies rapidly degrading into the vicious, guttural snarls of trapped animals. Valerie was relentlessly tearing into Garrett, blaming his reckless syndicate debts, his blatant incompetence, and his drunken boastfulness at the charity gala for drawing the attention of a hostile corporate extraction team. Garrett fired back with equal venom, mocking her reliance on outdated architectural tricks and cheap, heavily sedated security contractors. Listening to them tear each other apart was profoundly, deeply satisfying. For 2 entire years, they had operated with the cold, unified precision of apex predators feeding off the suffering of my daughter. Now the invisible, crushing pressure I had applied was forcing their unholy alliance to violently fracture. The psychological operation was working flawlessly. The moment arrogant criminals realize their impenetrable fortress has been compromised, paranoia instantly infects their judgment. They stop looking for the actual enemy and immediately start looking at each other to assign the blame. I leaned back against the plush cushions of my armchair, my breathing perfectly even. They had absolutely no idea that the true architect of their destruction was sitting just 3 miles away, comfortably drinking tea in the very house they had tried to steal from me a few hours earlier. The argument in the hidden room rapidly escalated from bitter shouting accusations to outright high-stakes extortion. I pressed my index finger against the earpiece, ensuring I captured every single syllable of their mutual destruction on my secure hard drive. Garrett's voice suddenly dropped an octave, losing its frantic, high-pitched panic and adopting a cold, venomous tone that signaled a desperate man playing his final, deadliest card. "Do not push me," Val Garrett hissed, his words dripping with pure malice. "Do not try to pin this entire extraction on my financial liabilities. If you think you can throw me under the bus to save your pristine medical reputation, you are severely mistaken." I heard Valerie scoff, a sharp, arrogant sound echoing through the microphone. "What are you going to do, Garrett? You are a broke venture capitalist with a federal freeze on your corporate accounts and a syndicate hit squad looking to collect your head. You have absolutely zero leverage over me." "Oh, I have absolute leverage," Garrett countered, his voice terrifyingly calm and calculated. "Did you really think I trusted a sociopath like you enough to operate blindly? I have kept meticulous encrypted digital logs of every single narcotic, sedative, and paralytic you illegally sourced to keep Camille compliant. I have the dark web purchase receipts, the forged inventory manifests from your clinic pharmacy, and time-stamped high-definition video evidence of you physically injecting your own daughter with unlicensed chemical restraints." There was a dead, suffocating silence on the audio feed. The absolute shock radiating from Valerie was palpable even through the tiny earpiece. "You recorded me," she whispered. her voice trembling with a mixture of sheer horror and homicidal rage. "I kept an insurance policy," Garrett stated flatly. "If I go down for corporate fraud and international extortion, I am handing that entire encrypted drive directly to the federal police and the National Medical Board. I will cut a plea deal for immunity, and you will spend the rest of your natural life in a maximum security federal penitentiary for the continuous aggravated chemical torture of a family member. Try to play me, Val, and I will personally ensure you die behind bars." I sat completely frozen in my living room. The sheer magnitude of their depravity was staggering, but Garrett had just handed me the final devastating weapon I needed to destroy Valerie's professional and personal life permanently. The implosion of their alliance was absolute. They were no longer partners in crime. They were locked in a state of mutually assured destruction. It was time to aggressively escalate the punishment. Garrett was already suffocating under a massive federal asset freeze, but Valerie still firmly believed she possessed her own vast personal wealth. She thought she could easily fall back on her private checking accounts, her exclusive platinum credit lines, and the massive financial resources she had accumulated through her elite psychiatric practice. She was operating under the delusion that her individual financial empire was entirely insulated from Garrett's corporate apocalypse. I opened my encrypted laptop, resting it on the glass coffee table beside my teacup. The power of attorney document she had so gleefully taken to the notary that morning had given Jonathan Cole's law firm absolute irrevocable control over our joint assets. But I was not going to stop at the joint accounts. Drawing on decades of aggressive forensic tax auditing, I accessed the central banking portals. I navigated through the complex labyrinth of Valerie's personal finances with the surgical precision of a seasoned federal agent. I targeted her exclusive black cards, her private wealth management portfolios, and her emergency offshore medical reserves. Using the emergency fiduciary protection clauses embedded in the documents she had just legally validated, combined with a few specialized digital backdoors, I triggered a cascading sequence of hard financial blocks. I watched the high-resolution screen as her available balances systematically plummeted to zero. I revoked her access to the clinic's operational funds, citing a sudden catastrophic audit flag. I canceled her high-limit credit cards, classifying them under severe fraudulent activity and identity theft protocols. Within 7 highly focused minutes, I had digitally severed Valerie from every single dollar attached to her name. She had built her entire identity, her arrogance, and her power around her wealth. She used money as a weapon to control everyone around her, including me. I stripped it all away with a few calculated keystrokes. She was no longer a wealthy, respected, untouchable doctor. She was a complete financial ghost. I closed the laptop securely, a profound, heavy sense of justice settling over me. The execution was moving perfectly on schedule. Valerie was about to step out of that concrete cell and into a harsh, unforgiving world where her money simply no longer existed. Desperately needing to calm her frayed nerves and reassert her superiority after the explosive, terrifying confrontation with Garrett, Valerie retreated to the one place that always made her feel untouchable. She drove straight from the clinic to the luxury shopping district in Buckhead. She walked into a high-end designer boutique, projecting her usual aura of wealthy, unbothered arrogance. She picked out a $5,000 designer handbag, a pathetic, transparent attempt to soothe her bruised ego and prove to herself that she was still in control of her life. She approached the gleaming marble counter and carelessly slid her personal platinum credit card toward the sales associate. The young woman smiled brightly and swiped the card through the terminal. The machine beeped a sharp negative tone. The associate frowned slightly, trying the chip reader. Declined. Valerie scoffed, her intense annoyance immediately flaring up. "Just run it again," she demanded sharply. "It is a premium platinum account." The associate shook her head, her polite customer service smile faltering under Valerie's glare. "I am so sorry, ma'am, but the terminal says the account has been permanently closed by the issuer. Do you have another form of payment?" Valerie's face turned a sickly pale. She frantically dug into her expensive purse, producing 2 more premium corporate credit cards. Both were swiped. Both were instantly, relentlessly declined. The other wealthy patrons in the quiet boutique began to turn and stare, their hushed whispers cutting through the tense air of the store. Valerie stood absolutely frozen in the middle of the gleaming boutique, utterly stranded, thoroughly humiliated, and without a single cent to her name. I sat perfectly still in my study, the encrypted audio feed from Garrett's compromised smartphone streaming directly into my cryptographic earpiece. After his explosive bridge-burning confrontation with Valerie inside the empty concrete cell, Garrett did exactly what a cornered, desperate rat does. He bolted. Through the high-fidelity microphone, I listened to the frantic, erratic sounds of his panic. He drove recklessly to his luxury downtown penthouse, the one he claimed to Valerie was undergoing plumbing renovations. I heard the frantic tearing of fabric, the heavy shifting of a painting, and the sharp metallic clatter of a hidden wall safe being wrenched open. He was scraping together whatever physical cash, loose diamonds, and untraceable bearer bonds he had stashed away for a catastrophic emergency like this. Then he made a frantic phone call. It was not to his high-priced corporate lawyers. It was not to the violent syndicate bosses he owed millions to. It was to a young woman named Chloe. My forensic investigation had already flagged her weeks ago. She was a 24-year-old fitness instructor he had been keeping in a high-rise apartment entirely funded by the money he had siphoned from our family. "Pack a bag right now." Garrett barked into the receiver, his voice breathless, sweating, and completely stripped of its usual polish. "Do not bring anything heavy. Just your passport and whatever fits in a single carry-on bag. We are leaving the country immediately." I booked 2 first-class tickets to Buenos Aires connecting through Montreal. We have to be at the international terminal in 40 minutes. I listened as the young woman asked a confused, sleepy question, but Garrett cut her off with brutal aggression. "Just do it, Chloe. If we stay in Atlanta for another hour, I am a dead man." The line went dead. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my cooling tea. He actually thought he could simply buy a plane ticket and fly away from the federal government. He had absolutely no idea the global airspace had already been slammed shut on him. I did not just sit in my study and listen to his pathetic escape attempt. I watched his final moments of freedom unfold in spectacular, real-time, high definition. Jonathan Cole's elite shadow team had seamlessly tracked Garrett from his downtown penthouse all the way to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. They tapped directly into the airport's vast closed-circuit security grid, routing the live video feed straight to my encrypted military-grade laptop screen. I watched Garrett abandon his imported sports car directly at the curb of the busy departure level, leaving the driver's side door wide open and not even bothering to hand the keys to an approaching valet. He grabbed a sleek leather duffel bag from the passenger seat and rushed blindly through the sliding glass doors. He moved with a jerky, erratic urgency, his head constantly swiveling over his shoulder. He was fully expecting the violent syndicate hitmen to step out from the crowded terminal at any given second. Scurrying closely beside him was Chloe, wearing oversized sunglasses and clutching her dark blue passport to her chest, looking terrified and completely out of her depth. Garrett grabbed her roughly by the arm, pulling her aggressively toward the premium priority check-in counter. He threw his pristine black passport onto the marble desk, demanding his boarding passes with that same arrogant, condescending tone he had used to insult me at the charity gala just 24 hours earlier. The airline agent processed his documents with a polite customer service smile, completely unaware of the massive digital tripwire she was about to trigger on her terminal. I leaned closer to the screen, watching every drop of sweat form on his forehead. Garrett was sweating entirely through his custom-tailored Italian shirt. He kept checking his expensive platinum watch, aggressively shifting his weight from foot to foot in pure anxiety. He truly believed that once he crossed the security checkpoint and sat down in the plush leather seat of a first-class cabin, he would be completely untouchable. He grabbed the freshly printed boarding passes from the agent, shoved one roughly into Chloe's chest, and practically dragged her toward the TSA pre-check lane. He bypassed the long, winding lines of ordinary working-class travelers, flashing his premium status ticket to access the expedited security corridor. He placed his heavy leather duffel bag onto the conveyor belt, took off his designer shoes, and stepped confidently toward the metal detector. He was just 10 feet away from the sterile terminal. 10 feet away from a luxury cocktail lounge and a direct flight to South America. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. He thought he had won. But the federal government does not let $500 million corporate fraud suspects simply walk onto an international flight. As Garrett reached his hand out to grab his plastic bin on the other side of the advanced imaging scanner, the security conveyor belt abruptly halted. A sharp, piercing digital alarm blared loudly from the TSA agent's monitoring station. The agent looked down at the screen, his casual, routine demeanor vanishing in a fraction of a second. He immediately stepped back from the console and signaled urgently to a specialized group of armed customs and border protection officers standing tactically nearby. "Sir, I need you to step to the side of the lane right now," the agent commanded, his voice loud, firm, and echoing across the checkpoint. Garrett bristled instantly, his arrogant, wealthy facade desperately attempting to mask his rapidly escalating panic. "Do you know who I am?" he snapped aggressively, trying to lunge forward and snatch his leather bag from the stalled conveyor belt. I am a platinum priority traveler. My international flight leaves in exactly 20 minutes, and I absolutely do not have time for a random security screening. He reached over the stainless steel table, but before his hand could even touch the handle of his bag, two massive federal officers physically stepped directly into his path. Their hands rested firmly on the heavy utility belts at their waists, their postures radiating absolute authority. Garrett Lawson, the taller officer, stated, his voice booming like thunder across the crowded security checkpoint. The entire bustling concourse seemed to fall completely silent. Hundreds of ordinary passengers stopped packing their bags and turned their heads to watch the unfolding spectacle. Your passport has been flagged by the Department of the Treasury. You are currently under a Level 1 federal travel ban initiated directly by the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. Garrett froze entirely, the blood completely draining from his face and neck. He looked exactly like a man who had just been struck by a high-speed train. A federal travel ban. He stammered pathetically, his voice cracking into a weak, high-pitched whine. That is a massive administrative mistake. I am a prominent venture capitalist. You cannot legally stop me from leaving the country. The officer pulled a thick, laminated document from his tactical vest and held it up. It is no mistake, Mr. Lawson. Your corporate assets, your personal banking accounts, and your international travel privileges have been frozen by an emergency federal court order. You are under extreme suspicion of massive wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate extortion. The heavy words echoed mercilessly off the high, vaulted ceilings of the airport terminal. People all around him were pulling out their smartphones, eagerly recording the wealthy, arrogant businessman as he publicly unraveled in real time. Chloe, the young fitness instructor he was desperately dragging into his chaotic nightmare, took 3 slow, horrified steps backward. Her eyes were wide with sheer terror. She looked at Garrett, realized the catastrophic danger she was standing next to, turned around and bolted at a full sprint toward the terminal exit, leaving him completely alone to face the consequences. Garrett reached his trembling hand out toward her rapidly retreating figure, but his voice completely failed him. He was out of leverage, out of money, and entirely out of moves. The violent syndicate creditors were waiting for him back in the city to collect his massive debts. His stolen fortune was permanently locked inside a digital federal vault he could no longer access, and now the federal government had him pinned directly to the floor. "Sir, put your hands behind your back immediately," the federal officer commanded sternly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. Garrett tried to pull his arm away, a pathetic, weak, and useless attempt to resist federal authority. The two officers did not hesitate. They immediately grabbed him by the shoulders, forcefully spinning him around and slamming his chest hard against the stainless steel security table. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists was the sweetest, most satisfying sound I had heard in 2 long years. I watched through the live video feed as the 2 federal agents grabbed him by the arms and dragged him roughly away from the checkpoint. His expensive leather shoes scuffed uselessly against the polished airport floor. He was whining loudly, begging for a corporate lawyer, completely stripped of his precious dignity and false power. The massive airport crowd watched him disappear into a private, windowless security interrogation room. I calmly closed the laptop sitting on my desk and took a long, deeply satisfying breath. Every single escape route was officially sealed. Garrett Lawson belonged to the federal prison system now. The heavy oak front door flew open with a violent crash, shattering the quiet sanctuary of my living room. Valerie stumbled into the foyer, breathing in ragged, frantic gasps. The immaculate, untouchable psychiatrist who had left the house in a pristine white silk blouse that morning was completely gone. Her designer jacket was violently wrinkled, her hair was disheveled in wild directions, and her expensive mascara was smeared down her cheeks in dark, jagged streaks. She looked exactly like a woman who had just survived a shipwreck, only to realize she was still sinking into the abyss. She collapsed onto her knees right in front of my armchair, her hands gripping my knees with desperate, trembling fingers. "Vincent," she sobbed, her voice cracking into a shrill, unrecognizable pitch. "It is a disaster, a complete and utter catastrophe. The federal government arrested Garrett right at the airport terminal. My clinic operational accounts are locked tight. My personal black cards are declining at every single terminal. The banks will not even speak to me on the phone. The authorities are freezing absolutely everything we built." I looked down at her, maintaining the frail, confused expression she thoroughly expected to see. "What are you talking about, Val?" I asked softly, deliberately, letting my hands shake just a little. "Garrett is in jail." Valerie nodded frantically, tears spilling freely onto the expensive Persian rug. "Yes," she cried out. "We need help immediately." "Vincent, you have to cash out your Postal Service retirement fund right now. You have to liquidate your pension today so I can hire a top-tier criminal defense attorney. The federal agents are going to come looking for me next because my name is tied to Garrett's corporate filings. You have to save me, Vincent. Please, you are the only one who can fix this nightmare." I slowly reached out and placed a comforting hand on her trembling shoulder. I let out a long, weary sigh, playing the role of the devoted, terrified husband to absolute perfection. "Calm down, Val," I whispered gently. "Panic will not solve anything right now. Take a deep breath." I slowly stood up from my armchair, utilizing my wooden cane for dramatic effect, and walked over to the silver tea service resting on the dining room credenza. I deliberately took my time, pouring a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea with steady precision. The delicate clinking of the porcelain cup against the saucer was the only sound in the room, providing a sharp, calculated contrast to her erratic, hyperventilating breaths. I walked back and handed her the warm teacup. "Drink this," I commanded softly. She took it with shaking hands, spilling a few hot drops on her expensive skirt, and took a desperate gulp. I walked over to my wooden desk and pulled a crisp, single-page legal document from my leather folder. I had instructed Jonathan Cole to draft this highly specific contract days ago, anticipating this exact moment of total financial desperation. I walked back and laid the document flat on the glass coffee table right in front of her kneeling figure. "What is this?" Valerie asked, her voice cracking as she stared blindly at the dense legal text. "This is our only way out," I explained, keeping my tone urgently persuasive and laced with manufactured fear. "I spoke to a lawyer friend from the postal union this morning when your credit card started declining. He warned me that if Garrett is under active federal investigation, the authorities will automatically seize any assets attached to your name by the end of the business day. They will confiscate your private clinic shares, your remaining personal equity, and your medical license holdings to pay off Garrett's restitution. But they cannot legally touch my assets because my financial record is completely clean and utterly untethered to Garrett's venture firm." I tapped the bottom signature line of the contract with my index finger. "You need to sign this right now, Val. It legally transfers your final remaining personal shares and private wealth portfolios directly into my name. It shields your last assets under my clean federal identity. If you do not sign this immediately, the federal government will strip you of everything you have left. I will hold your wealth safely for you until this terrible storm passes." Valerie stared down at the legal document, her eyes darting back and forth across the dense, complex paragraphs. For a fleeting second, the arrogant, calculating psychiatrist tried to surface. The woman who ruthlessly controlled every variable and manipulated everyone around her hesitated, her innate greed battling fiercely against her overwhelming terror. But she was operating entirely on adrenaline and blind panic. She had watched her financial empire evaporate in hours, and the looming, realistic threat of federal prison had completely shattered her rational judgment. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, searching my face for any sign of deception. But all she saw was the loyal, pathetic husband she had emotionally abused and severely underestimated for 40 years. She genuinely believed I was simply a desperate old man trying to save his wife from the government. She snatched the heavy brass pen from the coffee table. Her hand shook so violently that the tip of the pen nearly tore through the thick paper as she hastily scribbled her signature across the bottom line. With those frantic strokes of ink, she authorized the irrevocable transfer of her final, deeply hidden private assets, handing over absolute control of her clinic equity and her remaining wealth. Here she gasped, shoving the signed document back toward my chest. "Keep it safe, Vincent. Do not let the federal agents take it." I looked down at the fresh blue ink, verifying the signature was legally binding. I reached out, picked up the document, and carefully blew on the signature to ensure it was perfectly dry. I folded the paper with slow, methodical precision, creating perfect, sharp creases. I slid the contract into the inner breast pocket of my cardigan, patting it twice to ensure it was secure. Then everything changed. I did not need the wooden cane anymore. I let it slip from my grip, allowing it to clatter loudly and abruptly onto the hardwood floor. I straightened my spine, rising to my full height. The stooped posture, the trembling hands, the raspy, weak voice I had meticulously maintained all completely vanished into thin air. I looked down at Valerie, who was still kneeling on the rug, clutching her teacup. I did not look at her with love, and I certainly did not look at her with fear. I looked at her with the cold, sterile detachment of a forensic auditor observing a finalized bankruptcy report. Valerie blinked rapidly, her brow furrowing in deep confusion as she watched my sudden physical transformation. "Vincent, what are you doing?" she whispered, the panic in her voice shifting into a new, unfamiliar dread. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. I opened the master control application for the house's integrated security system. With a single deliberate tap of my thumb, I initiated a full system override. A sharp electronic chime echoed through the foyer as the biometric locks on all the exterior doors reset, erasing Valerie's access codes and fingerprint data permanently. The front door clicked loudly, swinging slightly ajar to reveal the cold afternoon air outside. "What I am doing, Valerie, is finalizing the audit," I said, my voice resonating with absolute chilling authority. "You just voluntarily signed away the very last piece of financial leverage you owned. You have no clinic, you have no private wealth, and as of this exact second, you have no husband and no home." I pointed a steady, unwavering finger toward the open front door. "Step outside, Valerie. You are officially trespassing on my property, miles away from the shattered remains of my marriage, deep inside a highly fortified safe house located in the sprawling Georgia countryside. Camille was finally reclaiming her life. Jonathan Cole's elite ghost team had established a secure perimeter around the isolated property, ensuring absolutely no one could track her location. Inside the climate-controlled monitoring room, Camille sat wrapped in a thick wool blanket, holding a mug of hot bone broth. The physical toll of being locked inside a concrete cell for 2 years was undeniable. Her frame was terrifyingly frail, and her skin lacked its natural, healthy glow. But her mind, the brilliant, razor-sharp intellect that had engineered a revolutionary biomedical miracle, was completely untouched by Valerie's heavy chemical sedatives. She placed the ceramic mug on the desk and slid her chair closer to the massive multi-monitor workstation Jonathan's cyber warfare specialist had set up for her. The specialist, a quiet man who had helped fabricate the looping video feed that fooled Valerie, stepped back, giving Camille absolute control over the encrypted terminal. She cracked her knuckles, a small familiar habit that brought a sudden rush of warmth to my chest when Jonathan relayed the report to me later. Camille stared at the glowing lines of code cascading across the primary monitor. For 2 years she had been reduced to a helpless captive, a human key waiting to be exploited. Now she was the undisputed master of the digital battlefield. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with intense, calculating focus. The time for hiding was officially over. It was time to go on the offensive. Camille's fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard with blistering speed, executing complex command lines that bypassed standard commercial firewalls. She routed her connection through a dozen international proxy servers, masking her digital footprint before directly accessing the highly classified federal patent registry. Her target was the secure server hosting the source code for her synthetic blood plasma substitute. This was the exact biomedical marvel Garrett had tried to sell to a hostile foreign conglomerate for $500 million. Garrett and Valerie firmly believed that the patent simply required a straightforward biometric verification to transfer ownership. They thought Camille was the only lock. They severely underestimated her genius. Camille had never trusted the fragile nature of digital security, especially when dealing with a formula that could disrupt the entire global medical industry. She had woven a devastating contingency plan directly into the fundamental architecture of the code itself. It was a scorched earth protocol designed to obliterate the asset if it ever fell into the wrong hands. She accessed the primary authentication portal. The system automatically prompted her for a live retinal scan and a voice verification sequence. But instead of providing the standard renewal biometrics, Camille initiated a hidden distress sequence. She typed a rapid, heavily encrypted string of alphanumeric characters, a sequence only she knew, and hit the enter key. The effect was immediate and catastrophic for anyone trying to acquire the data. The command triggered a massive cryptographic cascade. The master files containing the synthetic plasma formula instantly fragmented into millions of disorganized, encrypted data packets. The entire source code scrambled itself, overwriting the foundational algorithms with impenetrable junk data. The patent was not just locked. It was digitally buried alive. Even if Garrett somehow managed to drag her in front of a verification terminal, now her biometrics would be entirely useless. The original code was completely inaccessible, transformed into a meaningless digital labyrinth that no supercomputer on Earth could decode. The only way to reverse the cascade and reassemble the formula was a manual hardwired decryption key that only Camille possessed in her own memory. She stared at the screen as the final confirmation window flashed bright green, verifying the total lockdown of the asset. A small, triumphant smile touched her lips. She had just effectively vaporized Garrett's $500 million leverage. While Camille systematically destroyed the digital foundation of his fraudulent empire, Garrett Lawson sat shivering on a rigid steel bench inside a freezing federal holding cell. His expensive Italian suit was deeply wrinkled, stained with cold sweat, and the grim reality of his sudden downfall. He had been stripped of his platinum watch, his leather duffel bag, and his arrogant dignity at the airport security checkpoint. He was completely isolated, desperately waiting for his high-priced corporate lawyers to arrange a bail hearing. But the people who were truly invested in Garrett's immediate future did not operate through legitimate legal channels. A heavy-set federal corrections officer walked slowly down the sterile concrete corridor, his heavy boots echoing loudly against the walls. He stopped directly in front of Garrett's cell, glancing briefly over his shoulder to ensure the surveillance cameras were temporarily disabled. Without saying a single word, the corrupt guard reached through the thick steel bars and dropped a small disposable burner phone directly onto Garrett's lap. The phone immediately vibrated, lighting up the dark cell. Garrett scrambled to pick it up, his hand shaking so violently he almost dropped the cheap plastic device. He pressed the phone to his ear, expecting to hear the polished, reassuring voice of his defense attorney. Instead, he was met with a chilling metallic voice distorted by heavy encryption. It was the principal intermediary for the underground syndicate, the ruthless foreign conglomerate that had fronted the money for the biomedical patent. Mr. Lawson. The distorted voice began lacking any trace of human emotion. We attempted to access the preliminary data vault using the security tokens you provided. Our technicians encountered a severe cryptographic cascade. The source code has been deliberately scrambled. The asset is entirely locked behind a distress protocol. Garrett felt his stomach drop into a bottomless abyss. The air in the tiny cell suddenly felt incredibly thin. "No, that is impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The asset is completely secure. It just requires the final biometric authentication. I have the girl. I have the original patent holder. You are experiencing a temporary firewall glitch." "Do not lie to us," the voice interrupted, the coldness in the tone slicing right through Garrett's desperate excuses. "We know you are currently sitting in a federal holding cell. We know your domestic accounts have been seized by the Internal Revenue Service. And we know the patent has been intentionally sabotaged. You have taken millions of dollars in operational advances from our organization, Mr. Lawson, and you have delivered absolutely nothing but federal scrutiny." Garrett pressed his back against the cold concrete wall, his entire body trembling violently. He realized with terrifying clarity that the federal agents who arrested him were actually the safest people he could possibly be dealing with. "Please, you have to understand," he pleaded, tears of pure panic welling in his eyes. "I can fix this. I just need to contact my partner. I need to make a phone call to the clinic. We can reverse the lockdown protocol. I swear on my life I will deliver the functioning code." The metallic voice on the other end of the line did not offer any sympathy or negotiation. "You will not contact anyone, Mr. Lawson. You have exactly 24 hours to provide the unencrypted, fully operational source code to our secure servers. We do not care about your federal charges, and we do not care about your frozen assets. If the functional data is not delivered by this time tomorrow, your life is completely forfeit. Do not fool yourself into believing that federal custody offers you any measure of protection. Our reach extends far beyond those steel bars. If you fail, we will easily reach you inside that prison, and your death will be agonizingly slow." The line went completely dead, emitting a sharp dial tone that echoed in the tiny cell. Garrett dropped the burner phone onto the floor, pulling his knees to his chest as he hyperventilated. The terrifying reality of his situation crushed down on him. He was trapped in a federal cage, stripped of his wealth, and he had exactly 1 day to unlock a digital vault he no longer controlled, or he was going to be murdered. Garrett sat in the freezing darkness of his federal holding cell, his eyes locked onto the cheap plastic burner phone resting on his palms. The terrifying metallic voice of the syndicate intermediary echoed endlessly in his mind. He had exactly 24 hours to produce the unencrypted source code, or he would be murdered right inside this federal facility. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He needed a bargaining chip. He needed a physical asset, a hard drive or a secure cryptographic token that could buy him time with the foreign conglomerate. He knew Valerie kept physical backups of her most sensitive patient blackmail files and secondary financial ledgers, hidden in a floor safe beneath the master bedroom of my house. If he could secure those ledgers, he could trade them to the syndicate or use them to extort the federal prosecutors for witness protection. He quickly snatched up the burner phone and dialed a local enforcer. He kept on a dark web payroll, a brutal mercenary he used to intimidate stubborn commercial tenants. Garrett promised the man everything inside the floor safe, plus an exorbitant wire transfer if he broke into my home tonight, tore the place down to the studs, and brought back every physical document he could find. I sat completely still in the center of my darkened living room. The only source of light was the pale silver glow of the street lamp filtering through the heavy window blinds. I held a crystal glass of neat bourbon in my right hand, gently swirling the amber liquid. I did not feel an ounce of fear. I felt the absolute cold anticipation of a hunter waiting for the trap to snap shut. I knew Garrett's psychological profile with perfect clarity. A drowning man does not calculate his movements. He thrashes wildly, grabbing at anything he can reach. I knew he would send someone to the house. He was desperate for leverage, and in his arrogant mind I was still just a frail, helpless old man sleeping alone in an empty house. He had absolutely no idea that Jonathan Cole's elite tactical extraction team had never actually left my property. After securing Camille at the safe house, a specialized detachment of ghost operators had returned to my residence. They were currently positioned in the deep shadows of my kitchen, the upstairs hallway, and the perimeter of the backyard, completely invisible and heavily armed. At exactly 2 a.m, a matte black utility vehicle rolled to a silent stop at the end of my street. 4 heavily built men dressed in dark clothing stepped out. They bypassed the front gate entirely, moving with practiced stealth toward the reinforced glass door of my back patio. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon, the alcohol burning a warm path down my throat. The intruders wedged a heavy steel crowbar into the sliding door frame. The reinforced lock popped with a sharp echoing snap. The men pushed the glass door open and stepped confidently into the darkness of my home, pulling out suppressed tactical flashlights. The moment the 4th man crossed the threshold, the entire house erupted into blinding, localized tactical light. The ghost team moved with terrifying, breathtaking precision. There were no shouts, no chaotic gunfire, and no hesitation. It was a masterclass in kinetic neutralization. The lead operator swept the legs out from the largest intruder, bringing him down to the hardwood floor with a heavy bone-rattling thud. The 2nd and 3rd men were incapacitated instantly by silent high-voltage stun devices applied directly to their necks. The final man attempted to draw a weapon from his waistband, but a ghost operator materialized from the kitchen shadows, disarming him with a brutal wrist lock and driving a knee directly into his chest. In less than 10 seconds, all 4 of Garrett's hired mercenaries were face down on the floor, their hands bound tightly behind their backs with industrial zip ties. I had not even stood up from my leather armchair. I set my crystal glass down on the coffee table and stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my cardigan. I walked slowly over to the lead intruder, who was groaning in pain against the floorboards. The tactical team leader crouched down and extracted a vibrating smartphone from the mercenary's front pocket. The screen was illuminated with an incoming encrypted text message desperately asking if the perimeter was breached. I took the phone from the operator. I did not need to ask the mercenary any questions. I knew exactly who was waiting on the other end of that digital line. I pulled my own encrypted federal device from my pocket. Earlier that evening, the high-ranking associates at the FBI, whom I had forwarded the initial dossier to, had made a highly lucrative move. When Garrett was arrested at the airport security checkpoint, the young fitness instructor he had attempted to flee the country with had sprinted out of the terminal in sheer terror. But you cannot simply run away from a targeted federal dragnet. The agents had apprehended her before she even reached the long-term parking garage. She was the woman who held the physical keys to Garrett's domestic laundering operation. She knew exactly where he hid his illicit cash, which shell companies he used to filter his syndicate payouts, and how he had manipulated my daughter's accounts. My FBI contact sent a highly secure, time-stamped photograph directly to my terminal. I opened the encrypted file. The high-resolution image showed Garrett's young mistress sitting inside a sterile, stainless steel federal interrogation room. Her designer sunglasses were gone and her face was stained with tears. But she was not refusing to speak. She was actively leaning over the metal table, holding a pen and signing her name across a massive stack of federal cooperation agreements. Faced with the terrifying prospect of decades in a maximum security women's penitentiary, she had not hesitated for a single second. She traded Garrett's entire domestic financial empire, every dirty secret, and every hidden ledger in exchange for full unconditional federal immunity. She had handed the government the final nail for his coffin. I transferred this exact photograph from my secure terminal directly to the captured mercenary's smartphone. I opened the active chat window connecting the mercenary to Garrett's burner phone inside the federal holding cell. I attached the high-resolution image of his mistress signing away his life. Beneath the photograph, I typed a single, devastatingly simple text message. I hit send, watching the delivery confirmation flash across the screen. Inside the freezing, isolated concrete walls of the federal detention center, Garrett felt the cheap plastic burner phone vibrate violently against his leg. He snatched it up with trembling hands, a desperate, pathetic gasp of hope escaping his lips. He firmly believed his hired men had successfully raided my home and secured the leverage he needed to appease the foreign syndicate. He opened the encrypted messaging application. The high-resolution photograph slowly loaded on the small, brightly lit screen. Garrett stared at the image of the young woman sitting in the interrogation room. He recognized the heavy federal documents spread out across the table. He saw her signature confirming her absolute betrayal. Every single domestic account, every hidden stash of emergency cash, and every lie he had ever told was now in the permanent possession of the United States government. The text message below the photograph consisted of just 4 words: "Your audit is closed." The sheer crushing gravity of his absolute isolation slammed into him like a physical weight. His wealthy, arrogant facade disintegrated into nothing. The foreign syndicate was coming to execute him in less than 24 hours. The federal government had completely dismantled his corporate empire, and the last person on earth he trusted had just sold him out to save her own skin. Every single shield he had constructed was utterly destroyed. Garrett's knees buckled beneath him. The burner phone slipped from his sweaty fingers, clattering loudly against the cold concrete floor. He collapsed entirely, curling into a pathetic, trembling ball on the ground of the cell, desperately gasping for air in a world where he had absolutely no one left to manipulate. The morning sun brought no warmth to Valerie's impeccably sterile world. At exactly 8 o'clock, the serene mahogany-lined lobby of her upscale psychiatric clinic was shattered completely. A convoy of black federal SUVs and marked Atlanta police cruisers swarmed the private parking lot, blocking every possible exit. Dozens of heavily armed FBI agents, flanked by lead investigators from the Georgia Composite Medical Board, poured through the double glass doors. Valerie was standing behind her receptionist's desk, aggressively demanding her bank on the phone when a senior federal agent snatched the receiver from her hand and slammed it down. The clinic was immediately locked down. Valerie screamed, invoking her medical authority and threatening massive lawsuits, but her arrogant protests fell on deaf ears. Federal agents marched directly into her private office. They did not search blindly. They moved with absolute terrifying precision. 2 agents approached the massive oak bookshelf, grabbed the silver fountain pen, and twisted it. The heavy mechanical click echoed like a gunshot. The bookshelf slid open, revealing the concrete windowless cell hidden behind it. The medical fridge, the intravenous stands, and the heavily soundproofed walls were laid bare for everyone to witness. The press had been tipped off anonymously. News helicopters hovered above the clinic, and aggressive reporters crowded the police barricades outside. Camera crews captured high-definition footage of federal technicians hauling boxes of illegal sedatives, forged patient logs, and heavy medical restraints out of the building. The pristine, untouchable fortress Valerie had built to cater to Atlanta's elite was instantly transformed into an active federal crime scene. The hidden dungeon where she had kept our daughter captive was broadcasted live across every major morning news network. Her darkest, most sickening secret was now public consumption. The exposure triggered an immediate, catastrophic domino effect. Valerie was physically escorted out of her clinic in handcuffs, her custom white suit glaring under the relentless flashing of paparazzi cameras. She was temporarily released on an emergency federal bond, a strategic move orchestrated by Jonathan Cole's legal team to ensure she experienced the full, agonizing reality of her social destruction before her inevitable criminal trial. By noon, the Georgia Composite Medical Board convened an emergency disciplinary hearing. Presented with irrefutable high-definition evidence of unlicensed chemical restraints, forged prescriptions, and the horrifying reality of the concrete holding cell, the board did not hesitate for a single second. They voted unanimously to permanently strip Valerie of her psychiatric license. The official decree was brutally swift, banning her from practicing medicine in any capacity anywhere in the United States. Her professional execution was absolute. The news spread through Atlanta's wealthy social circles like a highly contagious virus. The elite billionaires, politicians, and high-profile executives who had paid exorbitant sums for her absolute discretion panicked. They treated her name like radioactive waste. Within 3 hours, her private practice was entirely abandoned. Her elite patient roster transferred their files to rival clinics, desperate to distance themselves from a woman now internationally branded as a sociopathic kidnapper. The prestigious medical foundations she had chaired formally erased her from their directories. The hospital boards she had ruthlessly maneuvered to control issued public statements condemning her actions and severing all ties. 40 years of meticulously cultivating an image of superior intellect, refined grace, and medical authority evaporated into total nothingness. She had built her entire identity on being the smartest, most powerful woman in the room. Now she was nothing more than a disgraced, unlicensed criminal facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The sheer velocity of her downfall was breathtaking. Every single pillar of her arrogant existence had been systematically kicked out from under her. She had absolutely no money, no clinic, no license, and no allies. She was entirely alone, wandering the streets of the city she used to rule, desperately trying to comprehend how her impenetrable empire had burned to the ground overnight. Stripped of her phone, her car, and her dignity, Valerie was forced to do something she had not done in 30 years. She walked. The Georgia heat beat down on her as she trudged miles across the city, her expensive designer heels blistering her feet. Her immaculate hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat, her pristine white suit stained with dirt, and the grim reality of her new existence. She had nowhere else to go. Her offshore accounts were frozen, her credit cards were useless pieces of plastic, and the clinic was sealed with yellow federal tape. In her desperate, fractured mind, she clung to the only physical asset she thought she still possessed: the house. She genuinely believed that the power of attorney document she had forced me to sign yesterday morning meant she could simply kick me out and barricade herself inside. She dragged herself down our quiet, tree-lined suburban street, seeking the comforting shadow of the large colonial home. But, as she approached the manicured front lawn, her exhausted steps ground to a sudden, horrifying halt. The expansive green grass was completely covered in a chaotic, colorful mountain of her most prized possessions. Every single piece of her designer wardrobe had been mercilessly hurled out of the front door. $1,000 silk dresses, custom Italian suits, and expensive cashmere coats were piled carelessly across the dirt. Her collection of exclusive limited edition luxury handbags items she treated with more care and affection than her own daughter were tossed thoughtlessly onto the driveway. Her expensive jewelry boxes were emptied, their contents scattered across the concrete steps. It was an absolute physical manifestation of her complete eviction. She fell to her knees on the edge of the grass, her bleeding hands desperately clutching a ruined silk scarf. The reality of the power of attorney document finally pierced her panicked mind. I had not signed the house over to her. I had legally sealed the property, locking her out permanently and stripping her of her final safe haven. She stared at the mountain of discarded luxury, hyperventilating as the terrifying truth fully materialized. The heavy oak front door slowly creaked open. I stepped out onto the porch, looking down at the pathetic, broken woman kneeling in the dirt. I did not wear the stooped posture of a frail, grieving husband. I stood tall, my hands resting calmly in my pockets, my expression as cold and unforgiving as a steel blade. Valerie looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute horror as her eyes met mine. For 40 years she had looked at me and seen a weak, predictable postal worker she could easily manipulate and discard. Now, looking into my cold, dead eyes, the final devastating puzzle piece snapped into place in her mind. The synchronized federal raids, the flawlessly hijacked camera feed, the instantaneous financial freezing, the precise weaponized destruction of her entire life. It was not a rival corporate conglomerate. It was not terrible luck. It was me. She realized with a soul-crushing certainty that the quiet, unassuming man she had shared a bed with was the apex predator who had methodically hunted her down and slaughtered her empire. I stared at her, offering the merciless, silent gaze of an executioner. Valerie stared up at me from the wreckage of her designer wardrobe, the horrifying truth completely fracturing her already fragile sanity. The polished elite psychiatrist was dead. In her place was a cornered rabid animal. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged, violent heaves. She ignored the expensive silk dresses scattered across the grass and sprinted toward her secondary luxury sedan parked on the far side of the driveway. She frantically punched the keyless entry code on the driver's side door, tearing it open. She reached deep under the premium leather seat, ripping away a hidden magnetic lockbox. A second later, she spun around, her hands gripping a silver snub-nosed revolver. She marched directly up the front walkway, her blistered feet stomping heavily against the concrete steps. She stopped just 3 feet away from me on the porch, raising the weapon and aiming the barrel squarely at the center of my forehead.
"Give it back!"
She screamed, her voice a shrill, unrecognizable shriek that echoed violently down the quiet, tree-lined suburban street. "Give me back my money, Vincent. Undo the trusts. Reverse the transfers right now, or I swear to God I will blow your brains all over this porch." Her hands were shaking uncontrollably, the heavy silver barrel swaying slightly with every frantic breath she took. She was completely unhinged, driven entirely by the primal, consuming grief of losing her financial empire. She actually thought the threat of physical violence would somehow intimidate me. She thought a gun could reverse a federal asset freeze. She thought I was still the docile, obedient husband who would cower and surrender. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood perfectly still, looking right past the barrel of the loaded weapon and directly into her wild, bloodshot eyes. "You do not have the steady hands for a murder, Valerie," I said, my voice as cold and absolute as a steel blade. "You prefer to outsource your violence. You prefer to use heavy chemical sedatives and concrete walls so you never have to look your victims in the eye." I slowly placed my hands in the pockets of my cardigan, completely ignoring the loaded revolver aimed at my skull. "Do you want to know what I was doing while you were attending your prestigious medical galas and giving keynote speeches on mental health? I was counting. I counted every single day. 730 days, Valerie. 730 days you kept our own flesh and blood locked inside a windowless cage, pumping her veins full of unlicensed narcotics so you and that parasite son-in-law could steal her genius." Valerie's jaw trembled, her finger twitching dangerously against the metal trigger, but she could not find the words to interrupt the cold, heavy truth I was hammering into her fractured psyche. "You sat across from me at the dinner table every night for 2 years," I continued, my voice dropping into a lethal, quiet register. "You looked me right in the eye and manufactured fake tears over our missing daughter. You accepted the sympathy of our friends. You accepted donations for fraudulent search parties. You built your entire pristine reputation on the tragic narrative of a grieving mother. And all the while Camille was shivering on a thin cot right beneath your expensive leather boots, starving and terrified, wondering why her mother was systematically destroying her mind. You sold her soul for a bank account balance, Valerie. You traded your own child for offshore routing numbers and luxury handbags. And the most pathetic part of your entire operation is that you actually thought you were the smartest person in the room. You thought your medical degree and your arrogant superiority made you completely untouchable. You thought you could outsmart a man who spent 40 years dismantling global financial syndicates for the federal government. You are not a criminal mastermind, Valerie. You are just a greedy, desperate sociopath who made the catastrophic mistake of targeting the wrong man's daughter." "Shut up," Valerie shrieked, pressing the barrel of the revolver closer until it was just inches from my face. "Shut up and transfer the money back. I will kill you, Vincent. I have absolutely nothing left to lose. I will pull this trigger and take back my life." I let out a short, humorless laugh that caught her completely off guard. "You have plenty left to lose, Valerie," I stated flatly, maintaining absolute eye contact. "If you pull that trigger, you do not get your money back. The blind trust I established is legally impenetrable. It contains a highly specific dead man switch. If my vital signs cease, or if I fail to manually authenticate my status every 48 hours, every single dollar of your stolen fortune is instantly and irrevocably donated to a federal victim compensation fund. You will not see a single cent." But more importantly, I continued, slowly raising my right hand and pointing a single finger toward the upper corner of the porch ceiling. "You are not just threatening me. You are threatening a federal witness on a live encrypted broadcast." Valerie's wild, manic eyes darted upward, following the direction of my finger. Nestled discreetly in the architectural molding of the porch was a small, high-definition surveillance camera. A tiny, piercing red light blinked steadily in the shadows. That camera was installed by Jonathan Cole's elite extraction team. I explained, my tone entirely devoid of mercy. "It is not connected to a local hard drive. It is a direct hardwired uplink. The visual feed and the audio of you threatening to murder me are currently streaming in real time directly to the secure servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Attorney General's office. They are watching you right now, Valerie. They are recording every frantic word, every threat, and the loaded firearm you are aiming at my head. If you shoot me, you do not just face a murder charge. You guarantee yourself a lethal injection under federal capital punishment guidelines. You will be transferred to a maximum security supermax facility where you will spend 23 hours a day locked in a concrete box, heavily medicated and stripped of all your basic human rights. You will experience the exact same waking nightmare you forced Camille to endure for 2 years. The blood drained completely from Valerie's face, leaving her skin a sickening ashen gray. She stared at the blinking red light of the camera, the terrifying reality of her absolute, inescapable defeat finally crashing down upon her. The heavy silver revolver in her hand suddenly began to shake violently. Right on cue, the sharp, piercing wail of police sirens shattered the quiet suburban afternoon. The sound originated from the end of the street, rapidly multiplying and growing louder by the second. They were coming fast, a coordinated fleet of federal and local law enforcement vehicles swarming the neighborhood to secure the armed suspect actively threatening a key witness. Valerie's breathing hitched into a pathetic, broken sob. The remaining shreds of her arrogant defiance evaporated instantly. Her fingers went entirely limp, and the loaded revolver slipped from her grasp, clattering loudly against the wooden planks of the porch. She did not try to run. She did not try to argue. Her knees simply buckled beneath her. She collapsed onto the hard wooden floorboards, burying her face in her trembling hands, her body rocking with heavy, defeated sobs. I looked down at the ruined, pathetic woman kneeling at my feet as the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the front yard. The execution was complete. While Valerie was weeping on my front lawn, surrounded by federal agents, a very different kind of execution was taking place miles away in the heart of the financial district. Garrett Lawson was fighting a losing battle against the clock. Cornered, stripped of his liquid assets, and facing a lethal 24-hour ultimatum from the foreign syndicate, he had retreated to his final desperate stronghold. He convened an emergency unscheduled board meeting in the sleek glass-walled conference room of Camille's biotech firm. He had bypassed standard corporate protocols, locking out the legitimate board members and filling the leather chairs with shady proxy buyers representing the very hostile medical conglomerate that wanted my daughter's synthetic blood plasma patent. Through the hidden audio feed tapped into his phone, I knew exactly what his final pathetic play was. Garrett was attempting a fire sale. He was trying to liquidate the entire company, selling off its assets and intellectual property for a fraction of its actual worth. He did not care about the $500 million valuation anymore. He just needed enough immediate, untraceable offshore cash to buy a fake passport, hire a private extraction pilot, and disappear before the syndicate assassins or the federal authorities caught up with him. He sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, sweating profusely through his expensive Italian suit. His hands trembled as he pushed a thick, hastily drafted acquisition contract across the polished wood toward the lead proxy buyer. He was begging them to skip due diligence, promising them absolute control if they just authorized the wire transfer right then and there. The lead buyer, a cold, calculating man in a sharp navy suit, picked up a heavy gold pen. He leaned over the document, ready to sign away my daughter's life's work for pennies on the dollar. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom did not just open. They were shoved apart with a violent, unapologetic force that sent them crashing against the glass walls. The loud, explosive sound made every single man in the room jump. The lead buyer dropped his pen, the gold cylinder clattering loudly across the mahogany table. Garrett's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute shock as he stared at the entrance. I walked into the room. I was no longer wearing the soft, unassuming cardigan of a frail, grieving father. I was wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders squared, and my expression carried the ruthless, sterile authority of a senior federal auditor stepping into a condemned building. Flanking my right side was Jonathan Cole, carrying a sleek black leather briefcase and radiating the menacing, predatory energy of a veteran corporate shark who was about to devour his prey. Garrett shot up from his leather chair, his face flushing a violent shade of crimson. "What is the meaning of this?" he screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain of his panic. "Security. Get security up here right now. These men are trespassing." He slammed his hand against the intercom button on the table, but nothing happened. Jonathan had already handled the building management and the security desk downstairs. We owned the building now. "You are severely out of your depth, Garrett," I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly across the silent boardroom. "There is no security coming for you, and there is no sale happening today." "Who are you?" the lead proxy buyer demanded, narrowing his eyes at me and then glaring at Garrett. "Lawson, you assured us you had absolute executive authority to execute this transfer. If this company is compromised, we are walking away right now. Do not listen to him," Garrett pleaded, frantically, practically lunging across the table toward the buyer. "That is just my senile father-in-law. He has absolutely no legal standing here. He is a retired postal worker suffering from severe grief-induced delusions. Sign the paper. We have a binding verbal agreement." Jonathan Cole stepped forward, moving with deliberate, terrifying calmness. He placed his black leather briefcase squarely on top of the mahogany table, popping the brass latches with 2 sharp clicks. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of heavily notarized, legally binding federal documents. He did not hand them to Garrett. He slammed them directly onto the center of the table, right over Garrett's fraudulent acquisition contract, effectively pinning it down. "You do not have a binding agreement," Jonathan stated, his booming voice vibrating off the glass walls. "And you certainly do not have executive authority, Mr. Lawson. What you have is a severe misunderstanding of your current legal predicament." Jonathan tapped the top document with a heavy index finger. "As the lead counsel for the Hayes Family Trust, I am officially notifying this room that Garrett Lawson has been entirely stripped of his voting rights, his executive proxy, and his board seat." "That is a complete lie," Garrett roared, gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. "I am the acting CEO. I control the majority shares through my wife's medical proxy. You cannot just walk in here and declare me powerless. I will have you disbarred for this stunt." Jonathan offered a cold, predatory smile. "Your medical proxy was inherently tied to the shares controlled by Valerie Hayes. But as of 9 o'clock this morning, Valerie Hayes legally and irrevocably surrendered every single asset, share, and piece of private equity she possessed. She signed a comprehensive transfer of wealth directly into a blind trust managed by my firm, overseen exclusively by Vincent Hayes." Jonathan flipped to the second page, pointing to Valerie's frantic, jagged signature at the bottom of the stark white paper. "Your mother-in-law traded her entire financial empire to save herself from the federal government. She gave us the absolute majority holding of this company." The color completely drained from Garrett's face. He stared at Valerie's signature, his eyes darting frantically across the legal jargon. He realized in a fraction of a second that the foundation of his power was completely gone. Valerie had not just signed away her own money. She had signed away the company, stripping him of the only leverage he had left to appease the syndicate assassins. The proxy buyers did not need to hear another word. The lead buyer stood up immediately, buttoning his navy suit jacket with a look of pure disgust. He picked up his gold pen, sliding it back into his pocket. "This deal is entirely radioactive," he announced coldly, glaring at Garrett. "You lied to us, Lawson. You have no assets to sell, and you have just wasted our time. Consider our arrangement permanently terminated." The buyers gathered their briefcases and marched out of the boardroom without a single backward glance, giving Jonathan and me a wide berth as they exited. Garrett stood completely alone at the head of the massive table. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating. The reality of his total failure crashed down on him. The syndicate was going to murder him. The federal agents were actively hunting him. His wife had turned on him, his mistress had sold him out, and his mother-in-law had signed away his last remaining shield. He had absolutely nothing left. Then something inside his mind violently snapped. The sheer terror and the magnitude of his defeat broke his psychological composure completely. Garrett threw his head back and began to laugh. It was a loud, hysterical, unhinged sound that bounced aggressively off the glass walls of the empty boardroom. It was the desperate, manic laughter of a man who had completely lost his grip on reality. He stopped laughing abruptly, his chest heaving as he pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. "You think you are so smart, Vincent," he spat, spit flying from his lips as he leaned over the table. "You think a few pieces of paper signed by that idiotic woman can stop me. You are completely delusional. None of these documents matter. Valerie's shares mean absolutely nothing in the grand scheme of the corporate bylaws." Garrett slammed his fist against the mahogany wood, his eyes wide and bloodshot with absolute terrifying certainty. "Camille is dead!" he roared, his voice tearing through the room with raw, psychotic triumph. "She has been dead for 2 years. and according to the federal marital laws of this state as her legally recognized husband and next of kin, I am the sole absolute legal heir to her entire estate. I inherit her patent. I inherit her founding shares. I inherit every single thing she built. You are just a pathetic old man playing with fake paper. I own this company by default, and I will tear it down to the studs just to watch you suffer. You cannot stop me, Vincent. You cannot protect a dead woman. Garrett stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, his chest heaving violently as the echo of his vile declaration faded into the glass walls of the boardroom. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from him was intoxicating to his fractured mind. He genuinely believed he had found the ultimate legal loophole, the one unassailable trump card that neither Jonathan Cole nor my decades of forensic auditing could ever bypass. He leaned forward, bracing his sweating palms against the polished wood, a grotesque, victorious smirk spreading across his pale face. "You hear me, Vincent?" He taunted, his voice dripping with pure, concentrated malice. "There is no miraculous rescue. There is no hidden clause that can save you now. In the eyes of the federal government, a missing person is declared legally dead after a set period, and I have already filed the preliminary probate petitions. As her husband, I am the absolute, uncontested beneficiary of her entire estate. Every single patent, every line of code, every dollar this company ever generates belongs entirely to me. You can wave Valerie's signed documents in my face all day long. They mean absolutely nothing. I will take this to the highest appellate court in the country, and I will win. I will drain this company dry, and I will leave you to rot in that empty suburban house with nothing but the ghosts of your pathetic family." He threw his arms wide, a manic theatrical gesture aimed at the lingering proxy buyers who had paused at the heavy glass doors to witness the spectacle. "You see this, gentleman," Garrett shouted, his voice echoing shrilly. "This is what desperate men do when they have lost. They forge documents, they make empty threats, but the law is on my side. The intellectual property is legally mine. You want the synthetic plasma patent. I am the only man on Earth who can legally authorize the transfer. We can still close this deal today. We can still make history." I did not say a single word. I did not need to. I simply stood beside Jonathan Cole, maintaining a posture of absolute terrifying stillness. I watched the frantic, desperate greed consuming my son-in-law, knowing that his entire reality was about to be violently torn apart. The heavy, suffocating silence of the boardroom was suddenly broken by a sharp, rhythmic sound echoing from the marble hallway outside. Click, click, click. It was the distinct, undeniable sound of designer heels striking the polished stone floor with deliberate, predatory precision. The footsteps were unhurried, projecting an aura of absolute authority and lethal composure. The lingering proxy buyers standing near the entrance instinctively parted, stepping aside as if making way for royalty. The heavy glass doors swung open. Camille stepped into the boardroom. She was no longer the frail, shivering captive huddled under a thin thermal blanket in a windowless concrete cell. The heavy sedatives had been completely flushed from her system. She was dressed immaculately in a sharp, tailored charcoal pantsuit that mirrored my own. Her posture was flawless, her shoulders squared and her chin held high. Though her cheekbones still carried the sharp angles of her prolonged malnourishment, her eyes burned with an intense, devastating fire. She looked at Garrett with a gaze as sharp as a razor blade, radiating the undisputed authority of a sovereign reclaiming her throne. Garrett froze entirely. The manic, triumphant smirk violently melted off his face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. All the blood instantly drained from his head, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. His knees visibly buckled and he stumbled backward, his hip crashing hard against the edge of the mahogany table. He raised a trembling hand, pointing a shaking finger at the woman standing in the doorway. He tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely failed him, emitting only a pathetic, choked gasp. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the grave to drag him down to hell. "Hello, Garrett," Camille said. Her voice was steady, resonant, and completely devoid of fear. It cut through the stale air of the boardroom like a surgical scalpel. "I heard you were trying to liquidate my company," she continued, taking slow, measured steps toward the head of the table. "I also heard you were passionately discussing my estate. It is fascinating how quickly a grieving husband moves to probate when he thinks he has successfully murdered his wife." Garrett pressed his back against the glass wall, his chest heaving as he hyperventilated. "This is not real," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine. You are a hallucination. You are locked in the clinic. Valerie has the clinic secured. This is a setup." "It is very real," Garrett Camille replied, stopping just a few feet away from him. She crossed her arms, looking him up and down with an expression of pure, unvarnished disgust. "You and my mother severely underestimated the wrong family. You thought you could lock me in a concrete box and force me to hand over a biomedical patent that could save millions of lives. You thought you could sell my genius to a hostile foreign syndicate just to cover your pathetic amateur gambling debts. But you forgot one crucial detail. I engineered the biometric security framework, I built the source code, and I built the cryptographic cascade that just permanently destroyed your $500 million payday." The lead proxy buyer, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing horror, finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of the situation. He realized he was not just standing in a room with a desperate venture capitalist. He was standing in a room with a man actively involved in a severe, high-level federal kidnapping conspiracy. The billionaire partner turned absolutely white. He did not say a single word to Garrett. He simply shot a terrified glance at Jonathan Cole, turned on his heel, and sprinted down the marble hallway, desperate to put as much distance as possible between his corporate entity and the radioactive fallout of Garrett Lawson. Garrett watched his final lifeline vanish. He was completely alone. He lunged forward, slamming his hands onto the mahogany table, his eyes wild with terror. "Camille, please," he begged, his voice dissolving into a pathetic wet sob. "You have to undo the cryptographic lock. The syndicate will kill me. They gave me a 24-hour ultimatum. If I do not deliver the unencrypted patent, they are going to murder me. You have to save me. We were married. You owe me." Camille leaned over the table, bringing her face inches from his. She did not blink. "I do not owe you anything but a front-row seat to your own destruction," she whispered, her tone carrying the absolute merciless finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. "I am the sole owner of this company. You are a trespasser, and your 24-hour deadline is no longer a concern of mine." Before Garrett could process the gravity of her words, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom were thrown open with explosive force. A tactical unit of heavily armed federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation breached the room, moving with terrifying kinetic efficiency. They did not ask polite questions. They did not request cooperation. Garrett Lawson, the lead senior agent, barked, his voice booming like thunder. Two massive federal agents lunged forward, grabbing Garrett by the shoulders. They forcefully spun him around, slamming his chest and face violently against the polished mahogany table. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. He thrashed weakly, crying out in pain and panic, but the agents pinned him effortlessly, twisting his arms tightly behind his back. The sharp, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs ratcheting around his wrists echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. "You are under arrest for federal kidnapping, international wire fraud, corporate extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder." The senior agent read the charges with crisp, unyielding authority. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Garrett was hoisted roughly to his feet, his expensive Italian suit torn and disheveled. He looked back at Camille and me, his face streaming with tears of absolute, unfiltered despair. He was completely broken, stripped of his wealth, his arrogance, and his freedom. The federal agents dragged him forcefully out of the boardroom, his expensive leather shoes scuffing uselessly against the floor as he disappeared down the hallway, heading straight into the dark, unforgiving abyss of the federal prison system. 3 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was completely suffocated by media vans, satellite trucks, and hundreds of frantic reporters. The trial of Valerie Hayes and Garrett Lawson had evolved from a local scandal into a massive national spectacle. Inside the heavy oak double doors of the primary courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with an electrifying, oppressive silence. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing my charcoal suit, my posture perfectly rigid. Across the room, seated at the defense tables, Valerie and Garrett looked entirely unrecognizable. They had been denied bail, spending the last 90 days stewing in federal holding cells. Valerie's hair, once immaculately styled, hung in limp graying strands around her hollow face. Garrett had lost at least 20 pounds, his custom suits replaced by an ill-fitting standard-issue gray uniform. He constantly scanned the gallery with terrified, bloodshot eyes, fully expecting a foreign syndicate assassin to be sitting among the journalists. The prosecution called Camille to the witness stand first. She walked past the defense table without offering her mother or her ex-husband a single glance. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore an oath, and proceeded to deliver a testimony so cold, precise, and utterly devastating that the entire courtroom collectively stopped breathing. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She methodically detailed every single day she spent locked inside that windowless concrete room. She described the heavy chemical sedatives Valerie injected into her veins, the precise medical schedule her mother maintained to keep her docile, and the daily psychological torture Garrett inflicted while demanding the biometric keys to her synthetic plasma patent. Every word she spoke dismantled the defense's pathetic attempt to paint Valerie as a desperate, caring mother trying to protect a severely mentally ill daughter. Camille's absolute brilliance and unquestionable sanity radiated through the room, exposing Valerie and Garrett as nothing more than greedy, sociopathic captors. When it was my turn to take the stand, the high-priced, aggressive defense attorneys thought they could easily discredit me. They planned to paint me as a bitter, estranged, and out-of-touch elderly postal worker who had completely misunderstood a complex corporate transaction. They were entirely unprepared for the sheer overwhelming magnitude of my retaliation. Under the sharp strategic questioning of the lead federal prosecutor, I did not just tell a story. I presented a masterpiece of forensic financial destruction. The bailiff lowered the lights and I projected a massive high-definition digital map onto the courtroom displays. I spent the next 4 hours walking the jury through the darkest, most intricate corners of Garrett and Valerie's financial empire. I utilized the exact same relentless methodology I had honed over 4 decades at the Internal Revenue Service. I showed the jury the initial syndicate loans Garrett had taken, mapping the illegal capital injected into his failing venture firm. I displayed the fraudulent offshore routing numbers he had established in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the exact dates Valerie had forged the power of attorney documents with the specific time-stamped pharmaceutical receipts from her clinic, proving premeditation beyond any reasonable doubt. I even played the raw, unedited audio recording of Garrett's drunken confession from the charity gala, his arrogant voice echoing violently off the courtroom walls, bragging about laundering $500 million through anonymous international vaults. The defense attorneys scrambled desperately, throwing out dozens of frantic objections, citing privacy violations and inadmissibility. The federal judge, a stern, unyielding woman with decades of experience, overruled every single one of them. My evidence was bulletproof, collected legally through the emergency financial disclosures and fully authenticated by the FBI Cyber Division. I did not just dismantle their legal defense, I mathematically annihilated it. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, there was absolutely no ambiguity left in the room. I had painted a perfect, undeniable picture of a husband and a mother who were willing to sacrifice a human life simply to erase a gambling debt and fund a luxurious retirement. The jury did not look at Valerie and Garrett with an ounce of sympathy. They looked at them with sheer, unfiltered disgust. The jury deliberations were a mere formality. They returned to the courtroom in less than 3 hours. The foreman stood up holding the verdict sheet, and his voice carried a heavy, absolute finality. On every single count, including federal kidnapping, aggravated identity theft, international wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder, the verdict was a resounding, unanimous guilty. Garrett collapsed forward onto the defense table, burying his head in his hands as he began to hyperventilate. Valerie simply stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, her eyes wide and vacant, her mind entirely shattered by the crushing reality of her complete defeat. The judge did not offer them a shred of mercy during the sentencing phase. She looked down at Valerie from her elevated bench, her expression radiating profound professional and personal contempt. Valerie Hayes. The judge began, her voice ringing like a heavy steel bell. You weaponized the medical oath you swore to uphold. You utilized your psychiatric authority to chemically imprison your own flesh and blood. You are a disgrace to the medical community, and you are a profound danger to society. For your egregious crimes against your daughter and your husband, I sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The judge then shifted her piercing gaze to Garrett, who was visibly trembling, his breath hitching in pathetic, wet gasps. Garrett Lawson, you are a predator driven by nothing but rampant, unchecked greed. You attempted to sell a life-saving medical advancement to a hostile foreign entity merely to cover your own reckless, illegal debts. You treated human lives as disposable corporate assets. The syndicate you fear so deeply is the least of your concerns now. For your central role in this massive criminal conspiracy, I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto the sounding block with a sharp, explosive crack that finalized their destruction. I remained standing in the front row of the gallery, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my suit. Two heavily armed federal marshals approached the defense tables. They forcefully pulled Valerie and Garrett to their feet, locking heavy steel shackles around their wrists and ankles. The metallic clinking of the chains echoed through the quiet courtroom. They were stripped of their expensive designer suits and dressed in bright, glaring orange federal jumpsuits. The heavy reinforced doors of the courtroom opened, revealing a blinding storm of flashing cameras from the press pool waiting eagerly in the hallway. I watched in absolute cold silence as my former wife and my former son-in-law were marched out into the blinding lights. They lowered their heads in sheer agonizing shame, desperately trying to hide their faces from the cameras. The untouchable elite psychiatrist and the arrogant, high-rolling venture capitalist had been reduced to heavily chained, disgraced federal inmates. The public humiliation was absolute, serving as the final, irreversible punctuation mark on their shattered arrogance. I turned away from the heavy wooden doors, a profound sense of closure washing over my entire soul. The audit was permanently closed, and the debt had been paid in full. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a sky so clear and blue it almost hurt to look at. I sat on the old wooden porch of our suburban colonial house, the very same porch where I had once sat playing the role of a frail, defeated old man. Now the heavy burden of deception was entirely gone. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the familiar scent of blooming jasmine from the garden I had meticulously restored over the past few months. Beside me, sipping from a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, sat Camille. The transformation in my daughter was nothing short of miraculous. The hollow, terrified prisoner who had shivered under a thermal blanket in a windowless concrete cell was completely gone. In her place sat a vibrant, brilliant woman in the very prime of her life. The sharp, unhealthy angles of her face had filled out. Her skin had regained its rich, natural warmth, and her dark eyes sparkled with an undeniable, fierce intelligence. We sat together in a comfortable, profound silence, simply watching the neighborhood wake up around us. There was no need for constant conversation. We had survived the darkest crucible imaginable, and the quiet, uninterrupted peace of this ordinary morning was the greatest victory we could have ever asked for. The house behind us, once a fortress of Valerie's arrogant expectations and hidden sins, had been entirely purified. I had methodically stripped away every trace of her expensive, hollow decorations, replacing the cold luxury with genuine lived-in warmth. It was no longer a stage for a sociopathic psychiatrist and a greedy venture capitalist. It was a home again. Our home. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid ground me firmly in the present reality. We had fought a war in the shadows, and we had won. With Garrett and Valerie permanently locked inside the federal penitentiary system, the complex legal web they had spun around Camille's life was systematically dismantled. Jonathan Cole and his formidable team of corporate attorneys worked relentlessly to reverse the fraudulent power of attorney documents and nullify the hostile acquisition contracts. The federal courts officially restored Camille's absolute legal autonomy and reinstated her as the sole, uncontested owner of her biomedical firm. Once her physical and legal safety was absolutely guaranteed. Camille returned to her highly secure server terminal. Using the manual decryption keys securely stored exclusively in her own memory, she effortlessly reversed the cryptographic cascade she had triggered on the day of her rescue. The scrambled, fragmented data packets seamlessly reassembled, bringing the revolutionary synthetic blood plasma substitute back online. But Camille did not just restore the patent. She weaponized it for the greater good. She forcefully rejected all buyout offers from massive predatory pharmaceutical conglomerates who wanted to hoard her invention for profit. Instead, she completely restructured her entire company, establishing an independent, ethical manufacturing pipeline. She secured massive federal grants and partnered directly with international humanitarian organizations. Today, her synthetic plasma is actively saving thousands of lives in global conflict zones, remote developing nations, and underfunded rural hospitals. She ensured the pricing remained strictly at cost, permanently blocking greedy corporate executives from turning her life-saving invention into an exclusive luxury commodity. She works long, demanding hours at her new, heavily secured research facility, but she always makes it home for dinner. She is thriving, commanding her industry with a level of ethical leadership and fierce determination that leaves her competitors in absolute awe. Watching her rebuild her empire from the ashes of Garrett's greed has been the most deeply rewarding experience of my life. She took the unimaginable trauma they inflicted upon her and forged it into an unbreakable armor. She proved that true genius cannot be caged in a concrete room, and a strong spirit cannot be broken by chemical sedatives. Her massive success is the ultimate undeniable revenge against the monsters who tried to erase her existence. I often reflect on the terrifying, chaotic journey that brought us to this peaceful porch. The cruel, unforgiving truth of my marriage had violently shattered the illusion of the life I thought I was living. For 40 years, I genuinely believed I was sharing my home with a loving, devoted partner. Discovering that the woman sleeping next to me was a calculated, ruthless predator could have easily broken my spirit. It could have driven me into severe depression or cynical bitterness. Instead, that brutal revelation acted as a violent, necessary purification process. It burned away the comfortable domestic lies and forced me to resurrect the cold, calculating forensic auditor I had buried in my retirement. I learned a profound lesson about human nature and illicit wealth. Greed is a spectacular, self-immolating fire. Valerie and Garrett possessed vast wealth, elite social status, and absolute privilege, yet it was never enough for them. Their insatiable toxic hunger for more blinded them completely to their own fatal vulnerabilities. They thought they were hunting a vulnerable, wealthy prey, entirely unaware that their overwhelming arrogance was marching them straight into a meticulously designed federal slaughterhouse. I did not have to resort to physical violence to destroy them. They destroyed their own lives through their sheer hubris. I simply handed them the digital rope, and their own massive egos kicked away the chair. Their federal sentences are exceptionally long, and their public disgrace is permanent. They will spend the rest of their natural lives locked in small, sterile concrete cages, completely stripped of the power, the money, and the prestige they worshipped above all else. The brutal truth cleansed my life of parasites I never knew I was hosting. The ultimate lesson of this entire ordeal is profoundly simple and absolutely unyielding. Family is not defined by mere legal marriage certificates or shared bank accounts. True family is built on unshakable loyalty, mutual respect, and the fierce, uncompromising will to protect one another from any threat, regardless of where that threat originates. I learned that a father's silence should never be mistaken for weakness, and that true, calculated discipline is the deadliest weapon against arrogant greed. My name is Vincent Hayes. I am a 69-year-old father who proved that you can absolutely destroy the monsters hiding in the dark if you are willing to become the flawless architect of their downfall. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let us meet in the comments. If you liked the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect. Another crucial lesson I carry with me is the undeniable danger of underestimating those who remain quiet. In a world that often equates loud arrogance with power, true strength is forged in silence. Valerie and Garrett believed my calm demeanor was a symptom of weakness. They mistook my patience for complete ignorance. They never realized that a quiet man is often the one listening the closest, observing every single flaw in his enemy's armor. Never dismiss the silent observer, because when the time comes to strike, they will dismantle your world before you even realize the war has begun. Please share this video with anyone who needs a powerful reminder to never underestimate the quiet strength of a protective father.